Some men ride into town looking for work. Some ride in looking for trouble. Cade Rowan rode into Red Hollow, Wyoming, on a gray November morning looking for neither, and found both before sundown. This is the story of a woman who refused to lose everything, a man who had already lost too much, and the winter that nearly buried them both alive. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this tale travels. Hit that like button and stay with us until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, which Evelyn Mercer would always remember because Tuesdays were already the worst day of the week on a struggling farm. It wasn't delivered with any particular cruelty. Harold Briggs, the clerk from First Territorial Bank, rode up the dirt road to their property just after noon, handed her a folded envelope without quite meeting her eyes, and turned his horse around before she'd even broken the wax seal. That was almost worse than if he'd been mean about it. At least meanness gave you something to push against. That quiet, apologetic right-away said everything. We don't expect you to fight this, so we're not even going to pretend it's a conversation. Evelyn stood in the yard and read the letter twice. 30 days. The bank was calling in the full balance of the Mercer farm loan, principal, interest, and what the letter politely described as accumulated fees for administrative processing, which she calculated in her head to be another $11 nobody had ever mentioned before. Failure to satisfy the debt in full within 30 calendar days would result in foreclosure proceedings and the transfer of property title to First Territorial Bank of Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. She folded the letter back along its original crease and put it in her apron pocket. Then she went inside and started on the noon meal because her father needed to eat and her brother would be back from the eastern field in an hour and the potatoes weren't going to peel themselves. She did not cry. She hadn't cried since the day they'd brought her father home from the Caldwell logging site on a wagon board, his right leg crushed below the knee where timber had rolled wrong. That had been 14 months ago. She'd used up something that day, some reservoir of weeping she didn't think she'd ever fully refill, and since then the grief and the fear had just sat in her chest like river stones, heavy and cold and permanent. Her father's name was Thomas Mercer, and he'd been a hard man in the good years and a harder one since the accident. The leg had healed badly. He walked now with a carved pine crutch and a gait that looked like something was always trying to pull him sideways, and the pain never fully left his face, even when he slept. He was 43 years old and looked 60. He was sitting at the kitchen table when Evelyn came inside, his bad leg stretched out stiff under the table, whittling something small from a piece of pine scrap. He did that more and more lately. Sat and whittled little figures he never showed anyone and never explained. "Who was that rode up?" he asked without looking up. "Bank." His knife stopped moving. "And?" She set the potatoes on the counter and picked up the peeling knife. 30 days, Papa. They want the full amount." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that has weight. She could feel him working through it behind her. The math, the inventory of what they had, the inventory of what they didn't have, arriving at the same conclusion she'd already reached. "How much short are we?" "Depends on whether you count those processing fees they've added." "Count them." $243. Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll write to your Uncle Porter in Cheyenne," he said finally. "Uncle Porter has his own debts, Papa. You know that." "I'll write anyway." She didn't argue. Let him write. Let him believe something might come of it. She was the one who handled the actual accounts. The ledger book she kept under her mattress, the careful columns of what came in and what went out, and the widening gap between them. And she knew better than her father exactly how bad it was. Had known for months. Had been trying to figure a way through it for months, lying awake in the dark doing arithmetic in her head until her eyes ached. $243 in 30 days. She started on the potatoes. Red Hollow was not a prosperous town in the autumn of 1879, though it had been, briefly, during the timber rush 5 years earlier when the Caldwell Logging Company had moved operations into the hills north of the settlement and brought money and workers and noise with them. The town had built itself up fast in those years. A proper bank, 2 general stores, a hotel with actual glass windows, a church with a bell that you could hear from a mile away on a clear morning. Then the timber company had cut what it came for and moved on, and Red Hollow had contracted back like a lung losing air. Half the storefronts on Main Street stood empty now. The hotel still operated, but rented mostly to traveling salesmen passing through on their way to somewhere else. The families that remained were the ones who'd planted roots deep enough to survive the shrinking, farmers and ranchers and tradespeople who'd bet their lives on this particular piece of Wyoming dirt and couldn't easily unbet. The Mercer property sat 2 miles east of town along Broken Creek, 40 acres of bottomland that Thomas Mercer had homesteaded 12 years earlier when Evelyn was 9 years old and her brother Daniel was just learning to walk. The land was genuinely good. The creek ran reliable water through dry summers. The soil was heavy and dark and willing, and the eastern pasture held grass that stayed green longer into autumn than most grazing land in the territory. That was exactly the problem. Raymond Holt, who owned First Territorial Bank and also held silent shares in the Caldwell Cattle Company and 3 other enterprises in the territory, had been watching Mercer land for 2 years. The railroad surveys had come through the previous spring, and Holt had information, reliable, purchased information, that the Union Pacific's new spur line would run directly through the Red Hollow Valley within 3 years. Land along Broken Creek, land with water rights and flat bottomland and easy grade for track laying, would be worth 5 to 10 times its current value the moment that survey became public. Holt was a patient man. He'd made a careful study of the Mercer finances over the past year and concluded that patience was all he needed. The accident had done the work for him. All he had to do was wait for the numbers to add up against them, then call the loan at the right moment. He had called it now. Evelyn didn't know about the railroad surveys. She didn't know about Holt's calculations. She just knew that the letter was in her apron pocket, and there were 30 days on the calendar, and $243 she didn't have. The harvest supper at the Red Hollow Community Hall happened every year on the second Saturday of November, organized by the Church Women's Committee and attended by virtually everyone in the county who could get their wagon through the mud. It was potluck. Everybody brought what they had, and it served as the social event that kept scattered farming families from going entirely inward during the long winter months ahead. Evelyn almost didn't go. She had 100 reasons not to. The farm work didn't pause for suppers. Her father's leg was aching bad that week and made him irritable and hard to manage. She was tired in a way that had stopped being physical and become something more structural, like the tiredness lived inside her bones now. And she knew, she was not naive about this, that people in town had been talking. The bank notice wasn't exactly a secret. Harold Briggs had ridden out to their farm in full daylight, and in a small town, someone always saw. But Daniel wanted to go. Her brother was 17 and growing fast and desperately needed things to look at besides fence lines and creek banks. And Evelyn couldn't say no to him without feeling like she was taking something from him that he'd never get back. So she put on her good wool dress, the dark blue one that was starting to go thin at the elbows, and braided her hair and drove the wagon into town with Daniel sitting beside her, talking about nothing in particular, which was exactly what she needed. The hall was full and warm when they arrived, smelling of wood smoke and roasted meat, and the particular sweetness of dried apple pies brought from a dozen different kitchens. Long tables ran the length of the room, covered in mismatched cloths, crowded with dishes. Children chased each other through the gaps between adult legs. 2 men with fiddles played something lively in the corner, badly but enthusiastically. Evelyn found a place at one of the middle tables and sat, and ate, and nodded at the people who caught her eye and tried to look like someone whose life wasn't unraveling by the week. She noticed the stranger because he wasn't doing what strangers usually did at these community events. Most men who came to Red Hollow from outside, drifters, trail riders, seasonal workers, they came into a room like this one and they made themselves known. They talked louder than necessary. They stood near the food and the whiskey and made sure people saw them. It was a frontier habit, a way of establishing presence in an unfamiliar place, and Evelyn had seen it so many times it had become background noise. This man was doing the opposite. He was sitting at the far end of the last table, near the wall, with a tin plate in front of him and a cup of something, coffee, she thought, and he was just watching the room. Not with suspicion exactly, more like a man who had learned that a room told you more if you gave it time to forget you were looking. He was maybe 30, she thought. Hard to say precisely. He had the kind of face that weather does a number on early, all sharp angles and permanent squint lines around eyes the color of a storm coming in from the north. His clothes were clean but plain, canvas work shirt, dark wool vest, canvas trousers worn at the knees. His hands, resting on the table on either side of his plate, were the roughest hands she'd seen on a man his age. The knuckles had been broken more than once. He caught her looking. She didn't look away fast enough. He nodded once. Not friendly exactly, not unfriendly. Just acknowledging. She turned back to her plate. Later, maybe an hour later, after the eating had wound down and the fiddle players had switched to slower tunes and people had started drifting into the quieter conversations that a full stomach and warm room produced, she went to get more coffee and found him standing at the same pot, waiting. "Evening," he said. "Evening." He poured his cup and stepped aside to give her room at the pot. Most men, she'd found, either talked too much at these moments or went entirely silent and awkward. This one just stood nearby drinking his coffee like it was the most natural thing, not pushing conversation, but not manufacturing distance either. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "Rode in 2 days ago." "Looking for work?" He considered this. "Looking to see what's here. Work might be part of it." "Not much here lately," she said. "The timber company cleared out. Most of the seasonal ranch work dried up after the summer." "I heard." He glanced around the room. "Hall's still pretty full, though." "People are stubborn," she said. "It's a survival skill out here." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "What kind of work does a farm near here need done? If you were hiring?" She looked at him directly. "Who says I have a farm? You've got creek mud on the heel of your left boot, different color from the road mud, and your hands have been working ground recently. The calluses are in the right places." He said this without any show, just stating observations like they were weather facts. "Figured you weren't a town woman." Evelyn felt something shift slightly in her estimation of him, though she couldn't have said exactly what. "My family has a property on Broken Creek, 40 acres. Cattle? Crops?" "Some of both. Mostly crops this year. We had to sell down the cattle herd last spring." She paused. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She didn't tell people this. "Hard year?" "Seems like the whole territory had one," he said. "Some years just come mean," she said. "Nothing to do but get through them." He looked at her for a moment. Really looked, the way people rarely did, like he was taking in more than just her face. "Cade Rowan," he said, and put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm but didn't perform itself. "Evelyn Mercer." "Is there work on the Mercer place, Miss Mercer? Paying or otherwise?" "I don't know what you are yet," she said honestly. "I've had men offer to help before and regretted saying yes." "Fair enough." He drank his coffee. "I'm not in a hurry." She told him about the bank notice that night. She hadn't planned to. It came out during a lull in the noise around them. Daniel had wandered off to talk to the Gentry boys his age, and she and this stranger she'd known for 20 minutes were standing near the wall with their coffee cups. And somehow the silence between them opened up the way silence sometimes did with people you weren't trying to impress, and she found herself saying it out loud for the first time since the letter had arrived. "The bank is taking our land in 30 days if we can't pay the balance." He didn't say anything immediately, didn't offer empty reassurance, didn't make the small, horrified noise people made when they wanted to seem sympathetic without committing to anything. "How short?" he asked. $243. He was quiet for a moment. "What does the land produce in a good year?" "Good year?" She almost laughed. "A good year it could produce more than that in a single harvest. We had that once. 4 years ago, before my father's accident." She looked at the floor. "The land isn't the problem. The land is fine. It's everything else." "What does the bank want it for?" She looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "Banks in a territory like this don't usually push small farms hard unless they want the land itself. Too much trouble otherwise. What's on your property that's worth the effort to take it?" She hadn't thought of it quite like that. She'd thought of it as the bank wanting the money, wanting what it was owed. She hadn't thought to ask what they wanted the land for. "Water rights," she said slowly. "We have reliable creek access year-round. Most of the properties around us go dry in August. Ours doesn't." She frowned. "I suppose that makes the land worth more to someone." "Worth more than whatever debt you're carrying?" "A lot more, I'd think." He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then the debt is the excuse, not the reason." The room felt suddenly different around her. Not louder or brighter, just she saw it differently. The banker's table across the room, where Raymond Holt sat with his wife and the Caldwell Cattle Company men, looked different. The way Holt had caught her eye earlier and quickly looked away looked different. "I need to think about that," she said. "Probably worth thinking about," Cade Rowan agreed. He showed up at the farm the next morning. She was out at the near fence line when she heard the horse, and she straightened up from where she'd been working and watched him come up the road on a compact gray roan that moved like it had been covering ground for years and knew how to do it without wasting energy. Cade Rowan himself sat the saddle like he'd been born in one, easy and slightly slouched, not performing horsemanship, just sitting on a horse. "I didn't say yes," she called out to him. "I know," he said. "I brought tools." He had in fact brought tools. Strapped to the back of his saddle were a hatchet, a good handsaw, a coil of heavy wire, and a pry bar. He dismounted and tied the roan to the fence post nearest him and looked at the section she'd been working on. "Top rail's rotted," he observed. "I know. And the wire's rusting through at the east corner." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to tell you things about your own fence, Miss Mercer. I'm trying to find out where to start." She held his gaze for a moment. He was insufferably calm. She couldn't decide if that was reassuring or aggravating, and she suspected it was both, which was its own kind of problem. "East corner," she said. "Then we'll see." Dasam. What she saw over the following days was this. Cade Rowan worked like a man who had made a private agreement with himself about how much to give a task and intended to honor it, regardless of whether anyone was watching. He was at the farm before first light and stayed until there was no more light to work by. He didn't talk much while he worked, but the silence wasn't sullen. It was focused. The silence of a man with a specific thing in his head and his body engaged in getting it done. When he did talk, it was direct. No soft edges, no extra words. He asked questions that were actually questions, looking for information, not making conversation. He fixed the fence line in a day and a half. He found the leak in the root cellar roof that Evelyn had known about for 2 months but hadn't had time to address, and he patched it with cut pine boards and pine pitch before the week's rain came. He reset 3 of the barn door hinges that had been pulling loose from the frame. He did all of this without being asked for any of it specifically, just moving through the farm the way a man moves through a problem he's decided to solve, identifying what needs doing and doing it. Thomas Mercer, Evelyn's father, regarded him with the particular suspicion that a proud man has for someone doing his work. The first 2 days he barely spoke to Cade at all, just watched from the porch with that carved pine crutch under his arm, and his expression closed and difficult to read. On the 3rd morning, Cade found him at the barn, struggling one-handed with a piece of harness leather that needed resoling, and Cade simply sat down beside him on the barn floor and picked up the other end without a word and held it in the right position, and Thomas, after a moment, began working. They spent an hour like that, not talking, just 2 men and a piece of leather. That evening, Thomas told Evelyn, "He knows his way around a farm." "Yes," she said. "Where's he from?" "I haven't asked yet." Her father was quiet, then, "Probably should." She asked that weekend. They were at the creek together, which had not been planned. She'd gone down to check the water level after a dry spell and found him there already, crouched at the bank looking at the current with his forearms on his knees. "You're from out west of here," she said. It wasn't entirely a guess. Some quality in the way he moved through mountain country versus flat country. Something about the way he read weather. "Montana mostly. Before that, further west." He picked up a flat stone and turned it in his fingers. "My father ran horses near Missoula until I was 16. Then he didn't anymore." She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Trail riding after that?" she asked. "Some. Trapping in the winters. Whatever work came." He tossed the stone and watched it skip twice and sink. "I spent a winter in the mountains east of here, alone. Hard country up there." "How long?" 6 months. Storm came early and closed the passes before I could get out. I'd made camp at an old mining claim near the top of Bear Creek Canyon. Had enough food to last me 2 months, maybe. He paused. Had to stretch it. She looked at him. "How?" "Carefully," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite darkness, but was adjacent to it. A memory of something he had come through that had changed the shape of him. She didn't push it. They were quiet for a while, watching the creek. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "You could have ridden on a week ago." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I've ridden on from a lot of places," he said finally. "I'm good at it. Probably too good." He picked up another stone. "You're not going to sell." It wasn't a question. "No." "That's why," he said, and he threw the stone. The town's reaction to Cade's presence at the Mercer farm ran the full range of what small communities produce when they encounter something that doesn't fit their existing categories. Some people were generous. Ruth Keller, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, started setting aside small hardware items, nails, wire staples, hinges, when she had them to spare, and sending word out with the supply wagon. Old Joe Finch, who farmed the property north of the Mercers, came by twice to help with the heavier work and brought his ox for the stumping job that Evelyn had been putting off for 2 seasons. But others were less charitable. The loudest of these was Wade Pruitt, who managed the Caldwell Cattle Company's local operations and drank at the Red Hollow Saloon with enough consistency to make it his second office. Wade Pruitt thought, as he often told anyone who'd listen, that the Mercers had had their chance and burned through it, and charity given to a failing farm was charity wasted. He also thought, and said this less publicly, but with equal conviction, that some drifter coming in and playing at being respectable was an insult to men who'd built what they had from genuine toil. "You know what he is?" Pruitt told the men at the saloon one Tuesday evening. "He's a saddle tramp looking for a meal ticket. Woman's too stubborn to see it because she's desperate. When the bank takes that land, he'll be gone before the papers are signed." None of the men at the bar contradicted him. In Red Hollow, in 1879, Wade Pruitt's opinion occupied more space than it deserved to, partly because the Caldwell Cattle Company paid wages to a third of the working men in the county, and partly because Pruitt had a physical size and a meanness of expression that made disagreeing with him feel expensive. Word of these opinions made their way to Evelyn, as word always did in small towns. She didn't tell Cade what people were saying, but she watched his face when they drove the wagon into town for supplies, and men crossed the street to avoid having to acknowledge him, and she thought he probably already knew. One afternoon she asked him, "Does it bother you, what they say?" He was splitting wood at the time, working through a cord of pine they'd hauled from the north lot. He set the maul down and looked at her. "What do they say?" "That you're using us." He picked up another round of pine and set it on the block. "Do you think I am?" She had thought about this carefully, the way she thought about most things. "No," she said, "but I don't know why you aren't." He brought the maul down clean and split the round in one stroke. "Maybe I just haven't found a good reason to leave yet." "That's not much of an answer." "No," he agreed. He set the 2 halves aside and picked up another round. "I spent a lot of years not staying anywhere. You get good at it, good at moving on before anything gets complicated." He set the round on the block. "But moving on from a problem isn't the same as solving it. You're not obligated to solve our problems." "I know that." "Then why?" "Because I want to," he said, with a simplicity that stopped her. He said it the same way he said everything, flat, without decoration, like a man who had decided to stop prettying up his words. "That's all. I want to." She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't offer one. Chasem. The early snowstorm came on the 14th of November, 2 weeks after the bank notice, without the full warning the sky usually provided. They had 3 days. Evelyn knew what an early storm could do to what was left of their livestock. They had 4 cattle, 2 horses, 12 chickens, and a pair of pigs. And she knew what the cold would do to the root vegetables she hadn't finished bringing in from the east garden. She started working at first light and didn't stop. Cade was already working when she got outside. He'd been up before dawn, apparently, had already moved the cattle into the near barn and was finishing the work of banking hay around the base of the building to block the wind when she came out. He'd filled the water troughs and covered them with board sections against freezing and laid out extra feed. "Chickens are in," he said when he saw her. "Pigs, too." "When did you—" "Hour ago." He straightened up from the hay bales. "The east garden. How much is still in the ground?" "Half the turnips. Most of the carrots. The parsnips." "Then that's where we go next." They worked through the morning with the sky going progressively darker and heavier above them, the temperature dropping in steps, the wind picking up from the northwest in gusts that cut right through wool. Daniel joined them after breakfast and worked hard without complaining, which he always did when the work was urgent and visible. Her brother was good in emergencies, less good in the daily maintenance, but she'd take what the day offered. The first snow started falling just after noon. Not the soft, fluffy snow that photographers like to capture and children like to catch on their tongues. This was the serious kind, small and hard and driven sideways by the wind, the kind that accumulated fast and drifted fast and made it hard to see more than 20 feet in front of you. They kept working. By mid-afternoon, they had the garden cleared and the root vegetables stored and the animals secured. The snow was ankle-deep and coming harder. Evelyn's hands had gone from cold to painful to numb, and she was working on feeling only in her wrists. "That's everything," she called to Kate across the yard. He was latching the barn door. He turned and looked at her and then looked at her hands. "Inside," he said, with a firmness that wasn't a request. "There's still the inside." She went inside. Daniel made hot coffee, the strong kind, and Evelyn wrapped her hands around the cup and stood near the stove and let the feeling come back in burning increments. She heard Cade do one more pass around the exterior of the buildings. She could track the sound of his boots through the storm. And then he came in stamping snow from his feet, his face red with cold, his beard, he'd had 3 weeks of beard now, dark brown with a few gray threads in it, spangled with melting snowflakes. He sat down across from Daniel and accepted the coffee cup wordlessly. They sat like that for a while, listening to the storm hit the windows, all three of them too tired to talk and comfortable enough in each other's presence that silence wasn't uncomfortable. "The livestock will be okay?" Evelyn asked finally. "Should be. The barn's tight. I reinforced the north wall last week, which helps." He paused. "The old structure, though, the secondary shed, that's another matter." She knew what he meant. The secondary shed, where they kept the spare tools and the winter feed overflow, was the oldest building on the property. Her father had built it in the first year of the homestead and hadn't replaced it since, and it showed in every weathered board. "It's held before," she said. "It held before the north wall started pulling away from the roof beam. I noticed it 2 days ago." He looked at her steadily. "I was going to address it before the snow came. Ran out of time." She felt the familiar cold weight settle in her chest. "One more thing. We'll check it when the storm breaks," she said. Outside the wind picked up, and the windows shuddered in their frames. The storm lasted 3 days. They didn't lose the animals. They lost 4 chickens to the cold despite everything, which was better than Evelyn had feared. She'd been prepared to lose more. The cattle and horses came through without visible damage. The covered root vegetables survived intact. The secondary shed did not survive. It was standing when the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, when Evelyn went out into a world that had gone white and still and achingly bright, the sky a blue so sharp it hurt to look at. It was standing when Cade walked the property perimeter to check the fence lines. It collapsed sometime that afternoon, while they were all inside. They heard it go. A slow, grinding sound that built and then released all at once into a crash that shook the floor of the farmhouse. Evelyn was on her feet and at the door before the echo faded, Cade right beside her, and they stood on the porch and looked at what had been a building and was now a pile of gray boards and bent iron collapsed under a load of accumulated snow. The feed stored inside was not destroyed, but much of it was only buried, but getting it out would take work, and the equipment stored there would need to be inventoried, and one piece of machinery that she could see from the porch had an angle to it that suggested it had been damaged in the fall. She stood there looking at it. 23 days left on the bank notice. She had not gotten any closer to $243. And now this. Cade stood beside her without speaking. She was aware of his presence the way you became aware of something reliable. Like a wall that's been there long enough you stop consciously noticing it until the day you need to lean against it. "We can salvage most of the feed," he said. "I know. The equipment, I need to look at it before I can say." "I know that too." He looked at her profile. She was aware of the look but kept her eyes on the collapsed shed. "Evelyn," he said. She shook her head slightly. Not now. She needed to be a person who could handle this right now, and sometimes being that person required not looking at what scared you directly. She stepped off the porch and walked toward the wreckage and started figuring out where to begin. That night, after Daniel was in bed and her father had retreated to his room with his leg aching, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the ledger book open in front of her and worked the numbers for the last time. She could see every possible path from where she was. She'd been seeing them for weeks, but she'd kept hoping one of them would change, the way you kept returning to a locked door, hoping someone had unlocked it while you weren't looking. None of them had changed. She could sell the cattle, all 4 of them. She'd get maybe $60 for the lot this time of year, with beef prices down. She could sell her mother's silver hairbrush set, which had come from Ohio when her parents first married, and the sewing cabinet and the good quilt, maybe another $20 for all of it combined. She could work through the winter doing laundry and mending for the town women, which she'd done before, and maybe make $40 or $50 by the deadline, if she worked every hour that she wasn't working the farm. That got her to about $130. Maybe. 110 short. Maybe more. She sat with the numbers and the lamplight and the wind-after-storm quiet of the Wyoming night, and she thought about her mother, who died when Evelyn was 14 of the fever that swept through the territory that year, and who'd loved this land without reservation, and who had believed that you could build something real and lasting here if you were stubborn and patient enough. Evelyn wasn't sure anymore if stubborn and patient were going to be sufficient. She was starting to suspect that the world required something more from you than stubbornness, and she didn't know what that was, and not knowing made the stone in her chest colder and heavier. She heard the creak of floorboards. She didn't look up immediately. "Couldn't sleep?" Cade said. "Working the accounts?" He came and sat across from her, not asking to look, just being present. He'd been sleeping in the barn, had offered, and she'd accepted, too practical to pretend there was anywhere else, and he'd come in through the back door quietly enough that she hadn't heard him. "Bad?" he asked. "Not good." She closed the ledger. "I'm $110 short of what I'd need if everything went right between now and the deadline, and nothing's been going right." He was quiet. "I've been thinking about it differently," he said after a moment. "How?" "The banker wants the land, not the money. You said it yourself. The money is just the way he gets the land." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. "What happens if we figure out why he wants this particular piece of land? And what happens if that reason becomes public?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Raymond Holt isn't pushing your family because he's a careful banker protecting his investment. He's doing it because there's something this land is worth that you don't know about yet." He held her gaze. "I've seen this before in other territories. Railroad surveys, mineral claims. Something the powerful know that the ordinary people don't. And the gap between what they know and what you know is exactly the size of the opportunity they're taking." The word railroad landed somewhere in her brain and sat there buzzing. "There was a survey crew," she said slowly. "Last spring. They said it was a county road assessment." Something changed in Cade's expression. It wasn't surprise exactly, more like confirmation. "County road crews don't usually carry transit instruments and elevation stakes," he said. "I passed their camp on the way into Red Hollow. I wondered about it at the time." The stone in her chest was still there, but something else was there now too. Something that felt uncomfortably like anger, which was better than hopelessness. Anger, at least, had edges you could grip. "If it's a railroad survey," she said carefully, "and the land along Broken Creek is in the path, then your 40 acres is worth considerably more than whatever debt Holt's holding over you," Cade said. "And he's trying to take it before anyone else figures that out." She stared at the closed ledger. The numbers in it hadn't changed. The deadline was still 23 days away. The money was still not there. But the problem, she was starting to understand, might be a different shape than she'd thought. A different shape meant different tools for addressing it. And that sliver of different, felt like something worth climbing toward. "I need proof," she said. "Yes. And I need to find it in less than 3 weeks." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. This man who had ridden in from nowhere with a gray roan horse and a pry bar, and a calm that she was starting to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. This man who had, against all reasonable expectation, chosen to stay. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked. "Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought again he wouldn't answer. "I've spent a lot of years passing through places where things were wrong and telling myself it wasn't my problem," he said finally. "That's a habit, and I'm starting to think it's a cowardly one." He met her eyes. This is a wrong thing. You're being cheated. Your family is being cheated. And I'm here, so. He stopped, seemed to consider whether to continue. And you haven't quit. That's. He shook his head slightly, as though the right words weren't available. That means something. To me. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and opened the ledger again. Then let's figure out what we know, she said, and where to start looking. Outside, the Wyoming stars were coming out hard and cold in the post-storm sky, and somewhere across the snow-covered valley, a wolf called once and was answered, and the night settled in around the farmhouse on Broken Creek, where two people sat at a kitchen table and began, carefully and with no certainty of success, to fight back. The ledger stayed open on the table until well past midnight. Evelyn had a habit, when she was working through a problem, of writing things down in two columns. What she knew for certain on the left, what she suspected but couldn't prove on the right. It was something her mother had taught her, a practical woman's way of separating fact from feeling so you didn't confuse the two when the stakes were high. She pulled a sheet of paper from the back of the ledger and started the columns now, and Cade sat across from her and watched her write and occasionally said something that shifted what moved from one column to the other. What she knew, Raymond Holt had called the loan 30 days after a survey crew spent 2 weeks in the valley. The survey had been described as a county road assessment. Survey crews for county roads did not, as a general rule, carry the kind of precision instruments Cade had described seeing at their camp. Holt owned shares in the Caldwell Cattle Company. The Caldwell Cattle Company needed reliable water access for the size of herd they ran north of town. What she suspected, the survey was railroad, not county. Holt knew the results. Holt was moving on Mercer land, and possibly other Broken Creek properties, before that information became public. He was using the debt as a lever, but the debt wasn't the point. The land with the water was the point. She stared at the two columns for a long time. Even if all of this is right, she said, suspecting it and proving it are different things. Yes, Cade said. The survey records would be filed somewhere, county seat maybe, or directly with the railroad company if it's a private survey. She tapped the pen against the paper. I don't have access to either. No? He leaned back in his chair. But you know who might have seen something. She thought about that. In a territory this size, a survey crew spending 2 weeks in the valley didn't exist in isolation. They bought supplies. They needed shelter, or at least water for their horses. They talked to people, the way travelers always did, because travelers got lonely, and small talk with locals was a way of passing evenings. The Kellers, she said. Ruth Keller stocks survey supplies, paper, marking stakes, that kind of thing. If a crew was working the valley in the spring, they might have come through her store. Worth asking. It's late. Not tonight, he said, with a patience that was becoming familiar to her. Tomorrow. She looked at him. In the lamplight, the angles of his face were sharper than in daylight, the shadows filling in the places where the weather had already done its work. He looked tired. Not defeated tired, but the functional tiredness of a man who had asked a lot of his body over many days and was running on the reserve now. You should sleep, she said. Probably. He didn't move. Cade. I know. He pushed back from the table and stood, and she noticed for the first time that he was favoring his left side slightly. Had been for the past 2 days, she realized, though she hadn't registered it consciously until now. You're hurt, she said. I'm fine. You're favoring your left. Old injury. The cold wakes it up. He picked up his coat from the hook by the back door. It's fine. She wanted to push it, but she could read in his expression that he was done with that conversation, so she let it go. Some things you had to offer and then step back from. Thank you, she said. For tonight. For... She stopped. She wasn't good at this part. For thinking the way you think. He paused with his hand on the door. You already saw most of it, he said. You just needed someone to sit across the table and say it out loud. Then he went out into the cold, and she sat with the two columns on the paper and the lamp burning low, and the farmhouse around her was quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet after a storm, when the violence has passed and what remains is just the cold and the dark and the fact of having come through it. She didn't feel hopeful exactly. Hope felt like too large a word for what she had, which was more like a direction. A direction was enough. It would have to be. Ruth Keller was a compact, practical woman of 50 who had been running the Keller dry goods store for 22 years and knew every piece of commerce that moved through Red Hollow the way a river knows its own current. She'd outlasted 2 business recessions, a fire that took out the back quarter of her storeroom in 1874, and a prolonged dispute with her husband's family over the business ownership that had nearly broken the marriage and ultimately strengthened it instead. She was not a woman given to sentimentality or idle conversation, and she and Evelyn had always gotten along well for exactly that reason. Evelyn came into the store the following morning, a Tuesday, when the light was still pale and thin, and the Main Street mud had frozen overnight into ridged brown concrete. She came alone, having told Cade she'd manage this particular conversation better without him, which he'd accepted without argument. She bought coffee beans and a spool of thread, actual purchases, nothing pretextual, and waited until the store was empty of other customers before she said carefully, "Ruth, do you remember that survey crew that came through last spring, March or April?" Ruth was behind the counter sorting invoices. She didn't look up immediately. "The road assessment crew." "Yes, I remember them. 4 men, 2 wagons, camped out by the mill pond for 11 days. She looked up now, the invoice in her hand, studying Evelyn with the bright, evaluating look that Evelyn had always associated with her. "Why? What did they buy from you?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet. "Stakes, the marking kind with the colored flags on them. Paper, 2 grade scales." She paused. "A transit level. They'd damaged theirs apparently, and I had one in the back that I'd taken on consignment from the Halverson estate." Evelyn kept her face neutral. Grade scales and transit levels were not county road equipment. County road crews worked with chain measures and simple sight lines. Grade scales were for determining elevation change across terrain. Transit levels were for precise horizontal angle measurement. They were railroad survey instruments. "Did they say anything about what they were assessing?" Ruth set down the invoice. The one who talked most, heavy-set man, reddish beard, said they were mapping drainage patterns for potential road improvements in the valley. She paused. "But they weren't looking at the roads. I drove past their camp once when I was out that way, and they were working the creek banks, specifically the flat sections with the good grade down to the water." She met Evelyn's eyes. Broken Creek bottomland mostly. The cold in Evelyn's chest was different now. Colder, but moving. The cold of something confirmed rather than something feared. "Ruth," she said carefully, "did they have any contact with Raymond Holt while they were here?" Something moved across Ruth Keller's face. It wasn't surprise. It was more like the expression of someone who had been carrying a thought for a long time and had been waiting to see if anyone else would arrive at the same place. "He had dinner with their lead man twice," Ruth said. "I saw them at the hotel dining room. The first time I thought nothing of it. The second time..." She stopped. "The second time I noticed they had papers spread across the table. Maps, I think. The kind on survey stock." Evelyn breathed slowly. "I don't know what any of that means," Ruth added, and her tone was careful. "But I've known Raymond Holt for 15 years, and I've never seen him take a personal interest in a county road survey before." "No," Evelyn agreed. "That does seem unusual." She paid for her coffee and thread and walked out into the frozen street and stood for a moment in the thin November light, thinking. The right column on her paper had just gotten shorter, and the left column had gotten longer, and that was progress. It was not proof, not the kind that would hold up if she brought it to any one official, but it was a shape. The shape was getting clearer. Debt. She found Cade rebuilding the collapsed secondary shed when she got back, or rather beginning the assessment of what could be salvaged versus what needed to be replaced. He'd pulled the snow-buried boards into rough, sorted piles and was working through them with methodical attention, setting aside the sound ones and discarding the rotted ones with the efficiency of a man who'd done this kind of evaluation before. "Well?" he said when she came up. She told him what Ruth had said. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, fully, with his attention actually on her rather than on formulating his response. "Survey instruments," he said when she finished, "and dinner meetings with maps." "Yes." He set down the board he'd been examining. "That's still not proof of anything specific. Holt could claim he was just being a community-minded banker, interested in local infrastructure. I know. We need the survey itself, or at least its general purpose. I've been thinking about that. She'd been thinking about it on the drive home, watching the frozen road, working it. The Union Pacific has a regional office in Laramie. If there's a survey on file for this valley, it would be there, or it would be filed with the Territorial Land Office. Laramie is 2 days' ride. Yes. He looked at her steadily. You can't go. You can't leave the farm right now. No, she agreed. I can't. He read her face. You want me to go. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm saying I can. He looked back at the boards. 2 days there, 2 days back. 3 or 4 days if I have trouble with the passes. There's been snow in the higher elevations. He calculated something in his head. That's 9 days minimum. Leaves you 14 days before the deadline, which isn't enough time to do anything useful with whatever you find. Depends on what I find. He picked up another board, tested it with his weight. Sound. He set it in the keep pile. And it depends on who else we've got in our corner when I get back. She understood what he was suggesting. The farmers, the other families along Broken Creek who would also be sitting on land that increased in value if a railroad survey confirmed what they were beginning to suspect. If Holt was moving on the Mercers, he was probably moving on others. And if the others knew what was happening, they might stop being isolated targets and become something else. Wade Pruitt, she said. He'll work against us. He's in Holt's pocket somehow, I'm sure of it. Pruitt talks loud, Cade said. Loud men don't always have the depth to back it up. He has the Caldwell payroll behind him. He has the threat of it. He turned to look at her. There's a difference between a man who'll actually move against you and a man who wants you to believe he will. You take Pruitt's measure wrong, and you give him power he doesn't actually have. She considered this. She'd been afraid of Wade Pruitt for months, not physically, but in the way you feared a heavy weather pattern moving toward you. His disapproval had weight in this community, and his connection to the Caldwell Company made him dangerous. But Cade's distinction was worth sitting with. There was a difference between a man who could make your life difficult and a man who could actually destroy it. When would you leave? She asked. Tomorrow morning. He glanced at the salvage piles. I can get this sorted today so your father and Daniel know what to work with. They can manage the main structures while I'm gone. He paused. Can your father handle being useful for a week? It was a direct question about her father's capacity, asked without cruelty but also without pretense. She appreciated that he didn't soften it. If he thinks he's needed, she said, he's better than if he thinks he's in the way. Then make sure he knows he's needed. Must. Thomas Mercer did not love the idea of Cade Rowan leaving for Laramie. He sat at the kitchen table that evening and listened to Evelyn explain the plan, and his expression went through several phases that she recognized: resistance, calculation, a reluctant recognition of logic, before arriving at something that was not quite acceptance but was adjacent to it. You're trusting a man you've known 3 weeks to ride 2 days in winter and bring back something that might not exist, he said. I'm trusting him to try, Evelyn said, which is more than anyone else is offering. That's not a... He stopped. Papa. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His knuckles were enlarged from old work and new cold, and in the lamplight his face looked its full age. I just don't like being the one who can't do it himself, he said, quietly enough that it cost him something. She reached across and put her hand over his. I know. They sat like that for a moment. He's a good worker, Thomas said finally. The admission came out grudgingly, the way her father released most admissions about other men. Yes, doesn't waste motion. He sipped his coffee. Knows which problems are the right ones to solve in what order. That's rarer than people think. I know that too. Thomas looked at her. The look went on long enough to be deliberate. Evelyn. Papa, don't. I'm not saying anything. You're about to. He set down his cup. He's not passing through anymore. That's all I'm saying. Man doesn't ride 2 days to Laramie in November for a farm he's passing through. She looked at the table. One problem at a time, she said. Her father made a sound that was something between agreement and amusement and went back to his coffee. Cade left before the sun was fully up the next morning, when the sky was still dark in the west and only beginning to lighten in the east. He'd packed light and practical. The gray roan carried bedroll, food for 5 days, and a leather satchel with paper and pencil for copying documents if he found them. He'd said his goodbyes the night before and didn't linger in the morning, which Evelyn appreciated because lingering in departures was something she had always found hard to do gracefully. She watched him ride out from the porch, her coffee cup warm between both hands, until the roan and its rider disappeared around the bend in the road and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the wind. Daniel came out and stood beside her. "He'll be back," he said, with the casual certainty of 17-year-olds who hadn't yet learned that the world didn't guarantee returns. "Go check the cattle," she said, not unkindly. He went. She stood on the porch a moment longer and let herself feel the absence, which was distinct from the loneliness she'd been living with for the past 14 months. Loneliness was a permanent condition, like low-grade weather. Absence was a specific thing with edges, and it had those edges because something had been there before it. She didn't examine this feeling too carefully. There wasn't time, and there wouldn't be time until the deadline had come and gone one way or another. She set down her coffee cup and went to start the day. The week that followed was the hardest she'd managed since the accident. Not because anything catastrophic happened, nothing did. The days were cold but not brutal. The animals needed their routine care. Daniel did his share without being pushed, and her father, true to what she'd told Cade, proved useful when given the framework to be. He couldn't manage the heavy physical work, but he could supervise the sorting and stacking of the salvage shed materials, and he could direct Daniel on the fence repairs on the near pasture. And he did both with the focused energy of a man who'd been given permission to be something besides injured. The hardness was the arithmetic. It was waking up each morning and subtracting another day from the remaining number. It was doing the rounds of her practical options: sell the cattle, take in laundry, write to relatives she didn't think could help, and finding none of them sufficient. She did write to her Uncle Porter in Cheyenne, not because she believed it would produce money, but because she believed it might produce information. Porter Mercer was a feckless man with expensive habits and more connections than sense, but he was plugged into the Cheyenne merchant and railroad community in a way that might give her something useful. She also paid a visit to Joe Finch, their neighbor to the north. Joe Finch was 63 years old and had been farming his piece of Broken Creek bottomland for longer than Evelyn had been alive. He was a widower, his wife gone a dozen years, and he ran his farm with his 2 grown sons in a comfortable, established way that spoke of debts long paid and improvements steadily made. He was not a man in financial difficulty, but his land was as good as the Mercer land, maybe better. His water rights ran even deeper, and his flat pasture south of the creek was the kind of ground a railroad survey would notice. She found him in his equipment barn, sharpening a blade on the whetstone with the patient repetition of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. He looked up when she came in, assessed her face, and said, "Sit down, Evelyn. I'll make coffee." Over the coffee, she told him carefully and without dramatics what she'd pieced together. The survey crew, the precision instruments, Holt's dinner meetings, the timing of the loan recall. Joe Finch listened the way old men who've seen a lot listen, without his expression changing much, turning the information in his mind the way he'd been turning the whetstone. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "Bill Stanhope got a letter from the bank last week," he said finally. "Accelerated repayment clause on his note." Bill Stanhope owned the property south of the Mercers, also on Broken Creek. "Did he?" Evelyn said. "And the Greer widow, Marion Greer. She's got the east property below the second bend. She told my son Henry that someone from the bank's been by twice asking about her water rights, whether they were specifically attached to the property or whether they'd transfer separate." He looked at Evelyn over his coffee cup. "Now, why would a bank want to know about water rights transferring separate from the land? Because if you can separate them," Evelyn said slowly, "you can own the water without owning the property. And if a railroad needs water stations along a route, they need reliable water every 20 miles or so," Joe said. "I know that from the Kansas lines. They buy water rights outright from landowners sometimes rather than buying the land. So it wasn't even necessarily the land Holt wanted. It was the water access along the route, which was worth serious money to a railroad company building infrastructure in dry country. The land seizures might be one strategy, water right separation another. Different instruments for the same purpose." Evelyn set down her coffee. The shape of the thing kept getting larger, kept gaining complexity. What had started as a single bank threatening a single family was revealing itself as something more systematic. Holt was moving on multiple properties along Broken Creek simultaneously, using different mechanisms on different families depending on their vulnerabilities. "Joe," she said, "when my man gets back from Laramie, I've sent him to look for the survey filing. I want to call a meeting. The Stanhopes, the Greer widow, you, anyone else along the creek who's had contact from the bank this fall, before the deadline." Joe studied her. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where we stop each being alone with the same problem," she said. "The kind where we figure out whether we have more strength together than we have separate." He was quiet. She could see him weighing it. The risk of being associated with a conflict against a powerful local banker, the risk of being wrong about what the survey meant, the risk of doing something that attracted attention to himself when he might otherwise stay below the waterline of Holt's interest. She could see all of this going through him because she'd gone through it herself and recognized the shape of it. Then he said, "I'll send Henry to the Stanhopes tomorrow." She was back at the farm by mid-afternoon and found a horse tied at her gate she didn't recognize. A heavy-chested bay with Caldwell Cattle Company markings burned into the saddlebag flap. She stopped the wagon and looked at it for a moment before she went inside. Wade Pruitt was sitting in her kitchen. Not invited in, she was absolutely certain of that. Her father's expression made it clear. But somehow there, with his hat on the table and his large frame arranged in her second-best chair as though he'd purchased it. He was a big man, Pruitt, with a blunt face that had probably been handsome once and had since been worked over by time and weather into something merely substantial. He was in his mid-40s and wore the Caldwell Company's prosperity in the quality of his coat and boots. "Miss Mercer," he said, standing. Standing was at least something. "Mr. Pruitt." She didn't take off her coat. "I didn't know you were coming by. Thought I'd save you the trip to town." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd decided in advance how this conversation would go. "I heard you've been having some trouble with your loan situation. Wanted to offer a word of friendly advice." She stood between him and the door and waited. "The bank's not your enemy, Evelyn." He used her first name with the casual authority of a man who believed his age and position entitled him to it. "Raymond Holt's a businessman. He's got obligations of his own. If this property can't service its debt, well..." He spread his hands in a gesture of regret that reached approximately as deep as his coat's outer layer. "Sometimes things run their course. Trying to fight that just prolongs the trouble for everyone." "That's very friendly advice," she said. "I've spoken to Holt. There might be an arrangement to be made. The Caldwell Company is always looking for good water access properties for summer grazing. If you were to sell voluntary before the foreclosure proceedings, you might come out ahead of what the bank would give you after." She looked at him for a moment. He was offering her a slightly better price to go quietly, which meant that either Holt was getting nervous about something or the Caldwell Company wanted the land badly enough to pay slightly more than distressed sale value, or both. Both, she thought. Both was probably right. "I appreciate you coming all the way out here," she said pleasantly. "I'll give that some thought." He read her face and understood she wouldn't, but he'd made his offer and he maintained his expression. "Don't wait too long," he said. "Arrangements like this have a shelf life." After he left, Thomas looked at her from across the kitchen. "He's threatened you," he said. "He made an offer." Same thing, in his mind. She agreed with her father on that. She went to the window and watched Pruitt ride out down the road, the big bay moving at a trot, and she thought about what his visit told her. It told her that something she was doing was working. You didn't send emissaries with alternate offers to people who were about to lose quietly. You only sent emissaries when you thought they might make noise. She was starting to make noise. Good. On the 6th day after Cade's departure, her Uncle Porter's reply arrived, which was fast enough that she figured he'd written back the same day he'd received her letter, either because he was unusually helpful or unusually alarmed, and she suspected the latter. The letter was 3 pages long, which was 3 pages longer than Porter usually wrote to anyone, and it was disorganized in the way his mind was disorganized, jumping between subjects and coming back to them, but buried in it was the information she'd been looking for. "There's talk in Cheyenne," he wrote, "of a short-line rail company called the Wyoming Basin Railroad, having completed a survey of the Red Hollow Valley corridor last spring. The principals of the WBR are not publicly listed, but there is a name associated with their Cheyenne legal arrangements that I think you should know. A man named Gerald Ashford, who is also a known associate of Raymond Holt from their dealings in the land speculation of the early 70s. I cannot tell you this is definitively connected to your situation, but I will tell you that in my experience, Gerald Ashford is never involved in anything that does not eventually turn a very large profit for Gerald Ashford and his associates. And if his name is near a railroad survey in your valley, then someone is expecting to make a great deal of money from land that currently belongs to people who don't know it yet. She read it 3 times. Then she put it in the same envelope as the paper with her 2 columns, what she knew, what she suspected, and added Wyoming Basin Railroad and Gerald Ashford to the left column. She'd asked Cade to look for Union Pacific survey filings. She should have thought wider. Wyoming Basin Railroad, a short line company, which would explain why the survey crew had been smaller than she'd have expected from a major railroad operation. Short line companies built the connective tissue between larger rail networks. They were often privately capitalized, less regulated, and able to move faster on land acquisition than the major lines. Holt didn't just have information about a survey. He was probably an investor in the company doing the survey. He wasn't just positioning to sell land to a railroad, he was positioning to profit from the railroad itself. She was still sitting with the letter when Daniel came in from the barn. "Horse on the road," he said, coming up from the south. She went to the window. Cha-cheet. The gray roan was moving up the road at a steady trot, rider leaning into the wind. Even at this distance, in the failing late afternoon light, she recognized the slightly forward set of the shoulders, the unhurried way the rider managed the horse. Cade was back. He came into the yard and dismounted and tied the roan, and she was at the door before he reached it. He was trail-worn. Days in the saddle showed in a particular way something compressed and roughened about the edges of a person. And he was cold through. She could see it in the color of his face and hands. But he was moving purposefully, no injury worse than the weariness. "Well?" she said. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded paper. It was document stock, heavier than correspondence paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, and it had a Territorial Land Office seal at the top that was still legible. "Wyoming Basin Railroad," she said, reading the header. "Survey filed March 15th, he said. "Certified true copy. The clerk in Laramie was—" He paused. "Persuadable." She looked up at him. "I didn't bribe anyone, Booka," he said. "I just explained the situation plainly and asked if there was a provision for affected landowners to access public survey filings, and there was." He almost smiled. "Public land records are public. People just don't usually know to ask." She looked back at the document. The survey route was marked in careful technical notation, but even she could translate it. The route ran directly through the Broken Creek bottomland, through the Mercer property, through the Stanhope property, and the Greer widows' land and Joe Finch's south pasture. The survey was dated and signed. It was real, and it was documented, and it was public record. "This is it," she said. "That's most of it." He reached into his coat again and produced a second paper, this one a printed notice, the kind posted in public places. Wyoming Basin Railroad filed a right-of-way application with the Territorial Office in October, 2 weeks after the bank sent your notice. The sequence of it lay out in front of her like dominoes that had already fallen. Survey completed in March. Holt, as an investor, gets the results. Right-of-way application filed in October. Holt calls the Mercer loan within days, files the application, starts the clock on land acquisition, triggers the debt to force a sale before anyone knows what the land is worth. "He timed it," she said. "He knew the right-of-way application was coming, and he timed the loan recall to the filing date. Looks that way." She felt the anger again, and this time it was clean and specific. Not the diffuse fear anger of someone being pushed in the dark, but the clear-edged fury of someone who finally understands the exact shape of the wrong being done to them. "Joe Finch is bringing the neighboring families together," she said. "As soon as I can get word to him, we can meet. We need to show them this." She held up the survey copy. All of them. Cade looked at her with that evaluating look she'd come to recognize. Not approval exactly, but something that registered what she'd done while he was gone. "You've been busy," he said. "You weren't here to help." "No." There was something in his voice that she didn't have time to examine right now. "I need to see to the horse." Daniel can help with that. I'll do it. He took back the documents carefully and held them out to her. Keep these somewhere safe, not the obvious places. Under the floorboard in the root cellar, she said immediately. He nodded, something like a real smile crossing his face before it was gone. All right. He went out to see to the roan, and she stood in the kitchen holding 2 pieces of paper that might be the difference between losing everything and holding on, and the wind outside pushed at the windows and the temperature was dropping again, and the calendar said 17 days remaining, and none of that had changed. But the ground under her feet felt different. She had been fighting alone in the dark, and now she had a shape to fight toward, a name attached to the wrong, and a man who had ridden 4 days through November cold in Wyoming to hand her the proof she needed. She put the documents in her apron pocket where the bank notice had been. Different paper now, different weight to it. She went to start the fire for supper. The meeting happened on a Thursday, 8 days before the deadline. Joe Finch's barn was the largest private structure in the Broken Creek Valley, a testament to 30 years of steady work and careful planning. And even so, it was crowded with the people who came, 11 families in total. The Stanhopes, father and 2 sons, all 3 of them built like fence posts and equally difficult to move once set. Marion Greer, the widow from the East Bend property, who was 61 and sharp as a splitting axe and had been running her farm alone since her husband died of a burst appendix 4 years back. The Halverson brothers, who held the north pasture above Joe's land. 3 other families whose names Evelyn knew but whose faces she was less familiar with. People from the outer edges of the valley who'd heard through the network that something was happening and had come to find out what. They came in the cold, bringing lanterns, and they arranged themselves on hay bales and overturned crates, and the grain storage bins along the east wall. And their breath made white clouds in the barn air, and they looked at each other with the particular wariness of people who had been isolated with the same trouble and were only now discovering the company. Evelyn stood at the front of the room beside the workbench Joe had cleared for the purpose. Cade stood to her left, a little back, not trying to be invisible exactly, but clearly positioning himself as support rather than center. She appreciated this about him more than she could easily express. A different man would have stepped in front. I'm going to tell you what I know, she said, and her voice was steady, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her coat, were not entirely. And then I'm going to show you the documents that back it up. And then I want to hear from each of you, because I think what I know is only part of what's happening. She told them everything, in the same order she'd assembled it. The survey crew in March, Ruth Keller's observations. The instruments that didn't match a county road assessment, Holt's dinner meetings, the timing of the loan recalls, the Wyoming Basin Railroad right-of-way filing, Porter's letter about Gerald Ashford, and the certified survey copy that Cade had brought back from Laramie, which she unfolded and held up so they could see the territorial seal and the route marked across their valley. The room was very quiet while she talked. When she finished, Marion Greer was the first to speak. The men who came about my water rights, she said. They said they were from the county assessor's office. Were they carrying county identification? Cade asked from his position near the wall. Marion thought about it. A letter, she said. I didn't examine it closely. County assessors carry stamped documentation, Cade said. Territorial seal signed by the county clerk. If you have that letter, it's worth looking at again. Marion's expression shifted into the look of a woman rearranging her memory of an event in light of new information. I'll find it, she said. Harold Stanhope, the elder of the Stanhope farmers, had the bank notice in his coat pocket. He'd brought it, Evelyn guessed, in the same spirit she'd brought her own documents, as evidence of something he hadn't known how to name until now. He pulled it out and looked at it, then looked at Evelyn. They gave us 35 days, he said. Yours was 30. Different amounts owed, his son guessed. Maybe, Cade said, or different timing on the right-of-way. If some properties need to be cleared before others for the initial track lane, they'd prioritize accordingly. This thought went through the room like cold air through a gap in the wall. The idea that Holt had a sequenced plan, that he'd timed each family's pressure according to a railroad construction schedule, made what had seemed like ordinary financial misfortune into something deliberate and layered. It changed the texture of the thing, made it harder to dismiss as bad luck. Peter Halverson, the younger of the 2 brothers, said, "What do we do with it? Even if all of this is true, we can't pay lawyers to fight a bank and a railroad company. We don't have that kind of money. He said this without accusation. It was a practical question, not a complaint. But it landed on Evelyn with real weight because it was the question she'd been wrestling with since she'd understood the shape of the problem. We don't fight them in court, she said. Not yet. Maybe not at all. What we do is make what they're doing visible. She looked around the room at the lantern-lit faces. Holt is depending on each of us being alone with this. He's depending on the Mercers fighting their loans separately, and the Stanhopes fighting theirs separately, and Marion not knowing what her water rights are worth or why someone's asking about them. The moment we're together and we know the same things, his strategy stops working. That's a nice idea, Harold Stanhope said, not unkindly. How does it stop the foreclosure? It doesn't, Evelyn admitted. Not by itself. She looked at the survey copy in her hands. But this is a public document. It's filed with the Territorial Land Office. Anyone can see it, and when families up and down this valley understand what their land is worth to a railroad company, when they understand they're sitting on something valuable that a powerful man is trying to take from them before they figure it out, some of them are going to stop being willing to sell quietly. And some of them still can't make their payments, Peter Halverson said. No, Evelyn said. Some can't. I can't. She said this directly without embarrassment because there was no point in performing a strength she didn't have. But there's a difference between selling because you're broke and selling because you don't know what you have. We owe people the second kind of choice, at minimum. The room was quiet again. Outside the barn, the wind was picking up. She could hear it working at the roof boards, testing the structure. Then Joe Finch said, from his hay bale near the door, "There's a man in Cheyenne, territorial newspaper, the Wyoming Examiner. They ran the story on the land fraud case in Carbon County 2 years ago." He looked at Evelyn. A story about a private railroad company using a local banker to clear land along an undisclosed right-of-way isn't nothing. That's the kind of story a territorial paper prints. How do we get it to them? Harold Stanhope asked. Someone has to go to Cheyenne, Joe said. Evelyn looked at Cade, and Cade looked back at her, and the conversation they had in that look was brief and clear. I'll go, Cade said. You just got back from Laramie, Evelyn said. Cheyenne is closer than Laramie. It's still 3 days. I know how far it is. His voice was quiet. It makes more sense for me to go than for you to leave the farm with the deadline coming. She wanted to argue with this on principle. She was aware, in a distant and presently impractical way, that she had been letting Cade do too many of the things that required leaving, and that this pattern was starting to feel like dependence, and dependence was something she'd spent her adult life being careful about. But principle was a luxury in the specific situation of 8 days remaining on a bank notice, and she was practical enough to know the difference. Take the survey copy, she said, and Porter's letter. The letter names your uncle. Porter can handle it. She wasn't entirely sure of this, but Porter had opened the door by writing what he'd written, and they needed everything. The meeting broke up an hour later. People went out into the cold and climbed onto their wagons and rode back to their separate properties. But they went differently than they'd come. The isolation was different now. They carried the same information, which meant they carried the same shape of the problem. And a problem with a shared shape is a fundamentally different kind of problem than one that lives only in your own head. Marion Greer stopped beside Evelyn on the way out and gripped her hand for a moment. Not a handshake, just a grip, and said, "You're your mother's daughter." Then she let go and walked out to her horse. Cade left for Cheyenne the next morning in weather that was already turning wrong. The sky had the look that experienced Wyoming people learned to read with something between respect and dread, a particular shade of gray-white that sat too low and too still, the kind of stillness that preceded serious movement. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since the previous evening and was still going. "Wait a day," Evelyn said at the gate. Not a request exactly, more like the thing she had to say before he left, so she'd said it. "No time," he said. He was loading the last of the supplies onto the roan saddlebags, methodical even in his hurry. 8 days, Evelyn. I know the number. If the weather turns bad, I'll find shelter and wait it out. He checked the rifle in the saddle scabbard. She hadn't even known he owned a rifle until this morning, which told her something about what he expected from the road. I've been in worse. I know you have. She looked at the rifle and then at him. That's not actually reassuring. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the particular expression he had when something amused him that he wasn't going to comment on. He pulled the saddlebag strap and buckled it. "I'll get there," he said, "and I'll get back." She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she had begun to hate how competent he was at leaving, even when the leaving was for the right reasons. She didn't say it because it wasn't the kind of thing you said to a man who was riding 3 days through approaching winter weather on your behalf. There was a time for those words, and this wasn't it. "Come back in one piece," she said instead. "That's the plan." He mounted the roan and looked down at her. His eyes in the flat gray morning light were the exact color she'd noticed across the harvest supper room. Storm gray, she'd thought then, and she thought it again now. "Get the families together before I'm back if you can. A unified group approaching the bank is harder to ignore than one family at a time." "I know. And watch Pruitt. I'm watching him." He nodded once. Then he turned the roan and rode south, and she watched him go until the road bent and the trees took him, and then she went in to start the day. What happened over the next 4 days was the kind of thing that only makes sense when you understand how small communities actually function, not through institutions or official channels, but through the dense, invisible web of who owes whom a favor, who went through what together, who showed up when it mattered, and who didn't. Evelyn drove to the Stanhope farm and sat with Harold Stanhope's wife Clara for 2 hours going through their actual financial position. Not what they'd told the bank, but the real numbers, which were better than Clara had believed because Harold tended toward pessimism, and Clara toward avoidance, and neither of them had looked at the ledger together in 6 months. Evelyn was good with numbers. She'd been keeping her own books since she was 15. By the time she left, Clara had a clearer picture, and Harold had a list of specific assets he hadn't been counting. She visited Marion Greer and helped her draft a letter to the Territorial Land Registrar asking for official clarification of her water right documentation and whether any transfer had been recorded or applied for in the past 12 months. Marion had found the letter from the men who'd come about her water rights, and Cade had been right. It had no territorial seal, no clerk's signature, just a business letterhead that said Wyoming Basin Land Survey Associates, which was not a county assessor's office by any name. She talked to Ruth Keller, who agreed, after a careful conversation conducted in the back room of the dry goods store with the door closed, to provide a written statement about the survey crew's purchases and the instruments they'd carried if it came to a formal challenge. She wrote a careful letter to the Wyoming Examiner in Cheyenne, summarizing the situation without making claims she couldn't document, and attached copies of the documents she and Cade had assembled, asking whether this was something the paper would investigate. She sent it with the twice-weekly Post Rider. She did all of this in 4 days while also running the farm, while also managing her father, who was having a bad week with his leg, and was consequently difficult in the way that people in physical pain are difficult. Not deliberately, but persistently, the pain finding its way out through his temper and his stubbornness on small things. On the 4th day, she was so tired she sat down at the kitchen table after supper and put her head on her arms and stayed there for a while without sleeping, just resting in the dark behind her own eyelids. Daniel came in and found her and didn't say anything, just set a cup of hot coffee near her elbow and went back out. She lifted her head and looked at the coffee and thought, not for the first time, that her brother was a better person than people generally gave him credit for, including herself. She drank the coffee. 4 days. 4 days left on the deadline. Cade wasn't back yet. He came back on the morning of the 5th to last day, and he came back wrong. She heard the roan first. The horse's gait was off, laboring more than usual, and she was at the window before she consciously decided to move. The roan was coming up the road at a walk, which was unusual enough to register, and Cade was in the saddle, but his posture was different from his normal ride. He was upright but effortful about it. The way you held yourself upright when doing so required active concentration. She was out the door and at the gate before he reached it. Up close she could see it clearly. His face was the wrong color, not the road ruddiness of cold travel but something grayer underneath, and there was a rigidity to his jaw that she recognized as pain management. His left hand on the rein was gloved, but the way he held it wasn't natural. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. "Ice on the North Pass coming back." His voice was measured. "Horse went down. Got my arm under me." "Get down slowly." I didn't say you weren't. Get down slowly." He dismounted, and she could see it cost him. The controlled way he let himself off the left side, keeping the arm close to his body. He stood in the yard and the roan pushed its nose against his shoulder, and he let it, which told her something about how he was feeling because he was not normally a man who stood still for affection. "Broken?" she asked. "I don't think so." He moved the arm slightly, and something in his face went briefly tight. "Maybe cracked. It's held up for 2 days." "2 days you've been riding with this?" "The papers are in the saddlebag," he said, like that was the relevant information. She got the papers first because she understood that he needed her to, and then she got Daniel to see to the roan, and then she got Cade inside. Her father looked up from his chair when they came through the kitchen door and read the situation in the first second. Thomas Mercer had, whatever his faults, been a practical man all his life, and practical men assess injury quickly. "Left arm," Thomas said. "Yes," Cade said. "Sit." Cade sat. Evelyn got the lamp and held it close while her father, who could not stand straight but could still use his hands with precision, examined the arm with the focused attention of a man who'd set more than one broken bone in his time. Cade sat through the examination without speaking, his jaw set, his good hand flat on his knee. "Cracked," Thomas said finally. "Ulna, I think, down near the wrist. Nothing shifted." He looked at Cade. 2 days? Roughly. Could have been worse. He said this with the particular approval that hard men gave to other hard men who'd done a hard thing without making noise about it. "Needs splinting and binding. You won't be using that hand much for 4 weeks, minimum." 2 weeks is what we have," Cade said. 2 weeks or 4 weeks, the bone doesn't care." "No," Cade agreed. "But I do." Thomas glanced at Evelyn over Cade's head, and the look that passed between them was the kind that carried a full paragraph in a single second. She looked back at her father steadily until he looked away. She splinted the arm herself, with her father directing and Daniel getting the supplies. Cade sat through it and said nothing, though at one point when she had to apply pressure to set the splint correctly, his good hand gripped the edge of the table and his knuckles went white, and she worked as fast and clean as she could and apologized with the efficiency of the task rather than with words. After, she spread the papers from the saddlebag on the table. There was a letter from the editor of the Wyoming Examiner, a different letter from the one she'd sent, meaning Cade had gone in person rather than just delivering her correspondence. The editor, a man named Charles Voss, had written in the compressed, precise style of someone who'd been in the news business long enough to say exactly what he meant and nothing extra. "Mr. Rowan," the letter began, "the documents you have provided, combined with the corroborating correspondence received from a Miss Mercer of Red Hollow, represent a credible account of a coordinated land scheme that this paper takes seriously. I am dispatching Mr. Elias Ford, staff correspondent, to Red Hollow by the Thursday coach to investigate further. Mr. Ford will require access to the individuals named in the correspondence and to any additional documentation available. We will not publish without thorough verification, but if verification confirms what these documents suggest, this will be a front-page matter. The Thursday coach." Thursday was in 3 days. The deadline was in 5. "You went to the paper in person," Evelyn said. "Letters get lost," Cade said, "or delayed, or opened." He was sitting with his splinted arm rested on the table. The color had come back to his face a little. A man walking into an editor's office with original documents is harder to ignore. "How did you even get there and back in the time I pushed?" He looked at the letter. "Voss is a good journalist. He's the one who broke the Carbon County case. If the evidence holds up, he'll run it." His eyes moved to her face. 3 days to the correspondent's arrival, 5 to the deadline. "I know." "If the story runs before the deadline, or even if Holt knows it's coming, he'll be more careful," she said, "or he'll try to move faster." "Yes." Cade was quiet for a moment. "That's the risk. A man who knows he's about to be exposed has a decision to make. Some men get cautious. Some men get reckless." "Which is Holt?" "I don't know him well enough." He looked at her. "Do you?" She thought about it. She'd dealt with Raymond Holt 3 times, always across a desk, always in the formal context of financial transactions. He was a controlled man, she thought. Controlled and patient, the way his whole scheme demonstrated. He'd waited months, maybe years, for the right moment. Controlled men didn't typically become reckless. "Cautious," she said. "Then the story might be what stops him. Or it might not come in time." "No," he agreed. "It might not." She folded the letter carefully and put it with the other documents. Outside, the sky was doing something she'd been trying not to look at directly. The same low, heavy gray-white as the morning Cade had left for Cheyenne, the stillness that preceded movement. But this time it was larger. This time the clouds were stacked higher, and the temperature had been falling since noon, and there was a particular smell to the air that people who'd grown up in Wyoming learned to respect. "There's a storm coming," Daniel said from the window. "Yes," Evelyn said. "A real one this time. Not the early November snow that had taken the secondary shed. Something with more intention behind it." The blizzard hit Red Hollow 2 days before the bank's deadline, and it hit the way the worst Wyoming storms always did, not with warning exactly, but with a kind of awful deliberateness, as though the weather understood timing. It started in the night. Evelyn woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of wind hitting the house with a force that was qualitatively different from ordinary winter wind. This had weight to it, pressure, like something physical being applied to the structure. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then got up. She dressed in the dark and went to the window. She couldn't see beyond the glass. Not the yard, not the barn, not the road. Just white, moving white, the lamplight from inside catching the snow and throwing it back at her like static. She went to the kitchen and started the fire. Cade was already there. She didn't ask how he'd made it from the barn in that weather. She could see the snow on his coat and in his hair, already melting in the kitchen warmth. His splinted arm was held close to his body. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad." He sat down. "I got the cattle moved to the main barn and the horses secured before it really came down. The feed situation is manageable for 2 days, maybe 3. How long will this last?" "Can't know for certain." He looked at the stove. "In the mountains, I've seen storms like this run 4 days. In the valley, sometimes less. The problem is the drifting. The wind out there is packing the snow into the low areas." He paused. "The north road is probably already impassable. The north road to town, where the bank was, where Elias Ford, the Examiner correspondent, was scheduled to arrive by Thursday's coach. If the north road was blocked, the Thursday coach didn't run." She sat down across from him, and they both looked at the stove for a moment. "The deadline is Friday," she said. "I know. If the road is blocked until Friday—" "One problem at a time," he said, which was the closest he'd ever come to offering her empty comfort, and he seemed to know it because he followed it with, "The priority right now is the farm, animals, structures, water supply. The rest we deal with when the storm breaks." She knew he was right. Worrying about the deadline while a blizzard was actively dismantling the world outside was a luxury they couldn't afford, but it sat in her, the arithmetic of it, the way everything had aligned to come apart at the same moment. "My father can't work in this," she said. "No." "And your arm is functional," he said firmly. She looked at his splinted left hand. "Cade." "It works," he said. "Enough. Don't argue with me about this right now." She didn't argue. They worked through the morning in teams, Cade and Daniel taking the barn rounds, Evelyn managing the house, and the root cellar supplies, and the food for the animals that could be passed out from the interior. Her father directed from the doorway, which was as far as he could manage in the wind, and she watched him standing there with his crutch and his bad leg and his jaw set against the cold, trying to be useful, and something in her chest pulled in a way that wasn't quite pain but was related to it. By noon, the snow was to the top of the fence posts. By mid-afternoon, they'd lost contact with the outside world as completely as if it didn't exist. No sound from the road, no movement visible from the windows, just the white pressure of the storm against every surface. That was when they heard the barn. Evelyn was in the kitchen making soup from the winter stores when the sound came. The same grinding and releasing sound she'd heard when the secondary shed went, but louder, more sustained, and coming from the wrong direction. The main barn. She was at the door before the echo faded. Cade was already in his coat, already moving. She didn't know where he'd been, but he was at the door 2 steps ahead of her, and she grabbed his arm instinctively and said, "Wait, the cattle? I know. Wait." She pulled her coat from the hook and got her boots in the lamp. Together. They went out together. The wind outside was a physical thing, a moving wall. She couldn't hear, couldn't see beyond the lamp's 6-foot circle. She kept her hand on Cade's coat and he broke the wind for her, moving with his good arm out and his body angled into the push, and they crossed the yard in what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably 2. The barn had not collapsed. The north wall had partially failed. The upper section had buckled inward under the snow load, and a beam had come down across the far end, and through the gap where the wall had given way, the snow was driving in hard. But the structure was standing. The cattle were alive, bunched at the south end, pressed against each other and the surviving walls. The horses were in the 2 stalls nearest the door, and they were frightened, whites showing, hooves restless, but uninjured. "The wall," Cade said, very close to her ear to be heard over the wind. "If it goes further, the whole north section comes down." "What do we need?" "Bracing, cross supports." He looked at the failed section, assessing. Even now, even in this, his mind moved in straight lines toward the practical. "Timber from the woodpile. Long pieces, at least 10 feet. I can jury-rig supports if we can get them in here." "In this weather?" "In this weather." He looked at her. His face was already red with cold, and the snow was in his eyelashes. "The cattle won't survive a full collapse. Not in this temperature." She knew that. She was already doing the calculation. Woodpile was on the east side of the barn, accessible from the interior if they could get the back door open, which meant not going back out into the blizzard for the timber. "Back door," she said. "The wood is on the east side. Lead the way." They spent the next 2 hours in the failing barn in the howling dark. Cade directing and doing as much as his splinted arm would allow, and Evelyn doing the rest, Daniel joining them 20 minutes in, having followed them from the house, and together they rigged 4 timber braces against the buckled wall section, lashing them with the heavy rope they found hanging in the tack area, and the wall groaned but held. It wasn't elegant. The braces were crooked and the lashing was imperfect, and there were gaps in the wall covering they'd attempted from old grain sacks and burlap that the wind picked at immediately. But it held. The cattle had room to stay warm. The horses settled. Cade sat down heavily on a hay bale when they were done. His right hand, his good hand, pressed against his left arm, where the exertion had done things to the cracked bone that he wasn't going to tell her about right now. She could see it in his face. She sat on the bale next to him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Daniel, 17 and burning the specific energy of youth, was already checking the rest of the barn's structure. "It'll hold through the night," Cade said finally. "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But it's what I think." She became aware that her shoulder was against his. The 2 of them pressed together on the narrow hay bale in the cold and the lamp glow. She didn't move away. Neither did he. Outside the barn, the wind was doing its worst, and the deadline was in 2 days, and the road was buried, and the newspaper correspondent was somewhere between here and civilization on a stopped coach, and she had $243 she didn't have, and a wall that might or might not make it to morning. "I keep thinking," she said, not really meaning to say it out loud, "that there's a point where stubbornness stops being a virtue." Cade was quiet. "My mother was stubborn," she said. "My father is stubborn. I thought it was just how we were. A family quality." She looked at the barn wall they'd just braced. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm just too proud to recognize when something is actually over." He turned his head and looked at her, which required turning toward her, which pressed his shoulder more firmly against hers. She didn't look back at him. She kept her eyes on the wall. "You asked me once why I was still here," he said. "You didn't really answer." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to try again." She waited. "I was 17 when my father lost his horse operation," he said. "Debt, mostly. Some bad luck on top of it. The bank in Missoula came in and took everything. The horses, the land, the equipment, all of it, inside of a month." He paused. "My father believed it was fair, that he'd borrowed the money and failed to repay it, and the bank was within its rights. He never questioned it." Another pause. "I spent a long time thinking he was right, that accepting the terms of a loss was just being honest, being realistic." "And now?" she asked. "Now, I think there's a difference between a fair loss and a manufactured one." He looked at the braced wall, the cattle breathing in the lamplight. "Your family didn't fail. You were maneuvered into a position to look like you had. That's different." He turned back toward her. "And watching you refuse to call it the same thing, watching you push back against calling it what it's not, that's why I'm here. Because you're right, and you know you're right, and you're not giving that up. She finally looked at him. His face was close, in the narrow lamp circle, the sharp angles and the weather-worn skin and the storm-gray eyes that she'd been looking at for weeks now without allowing herself to look at properly. There was something in them that she'd been carefully not naming, the way you were careful about fire when you needed the warmth but couldn't afford to burn. "Cade," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "One thing at a time." She nodded once, which was all she could manage, and they sat there side by side in the cold barn while the blizzard did its worst outside, and the wall held and the cattle breathed, and the lamp burned low, and the deadline ticked toward them like a clock neither of them could stop. But the wall held. For now, that was enough. The blizzard broke on the third day, the way Wyoming storms often did. Not gradually, not with a slow improvement of conditions, but all at once, like something that had been pressing down suddenly lifting its hand. 1 hour the wind was still forcing itself through every gap in the farmhouse walls, and the next hour there was silence, and the silence after that kind of storm had a different quality than ordinary quiet. It was the silence of a world that had been rearranged. Evelyn went out at first light and stood in the yard and looked at what the storm had done. The snow was chest high against the north side of every structure. The secondary shed site, still a cleared ruin from the earlier collapse, had disappeared entirely under a smooth white drift that made it look like the land had simply swallowed that piece of the past. The road was not visible. In its place was an unbroken white field that ran from the farmhouse to the tree line without any indication that a road had ever existed there. The main barn was standing. The braced wall had held through all 3 days, though when she opened the barn door and looked at the jury-rigged supports she and Cade and Daniel had put up in the dark and the cold, she felt a retrospective fear she hadn't had room for at the time. The braces were not good work. They were desperate work. The difference between the two had turned out not to matter, which was sometimes how things went, but she didn't take comfort in luck she couldn't count on repeating. The cattle were alive. All of them. The horses were fine. They'd lost 9 chickens this time. The storm had found a gap in the coop roof that she hadn't known about. And the feed situation was tighter than she'd wanted, but manageable. She went back inside and looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall. Friday. The deadline was today. She stood at the calendar for a long moment. The road was buried. The bank was 2 miles away in a town she couldn't reach without a half day of effort, and the effort would have to begin now, immediately, to mean anything. Elias Ford, the newspaper correspondent from the Examiner, had been due Thursday. Whether he'd made it to Red Hollow, whether the Thursday coach had run it all before the storm closed everything, she had no way of knowing. "Evelyn," Cade's voice from the kitchen doorway. She turned. He was dressed and his coat was on, the left sleeve loose over the splinted arm. His face was the focused, stripped-down version of itself that she'd come to associate with moments when he'd already done the thinking and arrived at the doing. "The road," she said. "I know. Get your boots." "Cade, your arm." "Get your boots, Evelyn." She got her boots. They didn't have enough hands to shovel 2 miles of road, and they knew it. What Cade's plan? She understood it was his plan by the way he moved toward the barn and started hitching the heavier of their 2 draft horses to the equipment sled, was to break a track through the worst of the drifts, not clear the road, but create a passage, the kind of rough channel that a determined horse could follow. Daniel, wordless and efficient, helped with the hitching. Thomas Mercer came as far as the barn door on his crutch and stood there watching, and when Cade looked back at him, Thomas said, "The Halverson brothers, their place is a 1/4 mile north. They have 2 big Clydesdales that can push through deeper than anything we have." "Can you get word to them?" Cade asked. "Henry Finch was supposed to come by yesterday. Storm probably held him." Thomas looked at the sky. "He'll come today. When he does, I'll send him to the Halversons." It was the most operational Evelyn had heard her father in months. She looked at him standing in the barn doorway with the cold light on his face and his bad legs stiff and his jaw set, and she thought that what Cade had said at the beginning was true. Her father was better when he thought he was needed, and for 14 months since the accident, no one had found the right way to make him feel that, including her. They started breaking trail at 7 in the morning. It was the hardest physical work Evelyn had done in recent memory, and that was a high bar. The sled pushed the worst of the surface drift aside, but the compacted snow underneath required the horse to lunge rather than walk. and she and Daniel took turns at the horse's head and with the shovels, alternating the impossible work of clearing what the horse couldn't push. Cade managed the reins with his good hand and did what he could with the bad one, and she watched him out of the corner of her eye and said nothing about it because there was nothing useful to say. They were half a mile from the farm when they heard the other horses. The Halverson brothers came from the north, with both Clydesdales hitched side by side in a configuration that wasn't standard but made brutal pragmatic sense. The two big horses pushing abreast cut a wider channel than either could alone. Peter Halverson was driving. His brother Martin was shoveling ahead of the team with an energy that suggested he'd been at it long enough to have found a rhythm. They met in the middle of the worst drift, maybe 6 feet deep and 20 feet across, and Peter Halverson stopped his team and looked down at Evelyn from the high seat and said simply, "Today's the day." "Today's the day," she agreed. "Then let's get on with it." They worked together from that point, the Clydesdale team leading and braking and Evelyn's draft horse following in the channel, and what had seemed like an impossible distance contracted steadily under the combined effort. It was not fast. It was ugly and cold and exhausting. But it moved. An hour and a half after they'd started, the rooflines of Red Hollow became visible through the cleared trees, and Evelyn looked at them with a feeling she didn't have a name for. Something between relief and dread, because arriving meant the confrontation she'd been building toward for 30 days was now a matter of minutes. The town looked like a place that had survived something and was only beginning to take stock of it. The main street was partially broken out. Some of the businesses had dug themselves accessible in the immediate aftermath of the storm, and there were people moving in the cleared sections with the deliberate, energized purpose that communities sometimes found in the aftermath of shared hardship. The hotel had smoke coming from 3 chimneys. The general store was open, and tied at the rails in front of the hotel, still carrying a dusting of snow from the previous days, were 3 horses she didn't recognize. Next to them, unmistakably, was a coach. Not the town's supply coach, but a hired rig, the kind used for private transport, with an out-of-territory marking on the door. She looked at Cade. "Thursday coach ran before the storm closed the pass," he said. He'd seen it at the same moment she had. "He's here." "Seems like." She turned the sled toward the hotel. Elias Ford was not what she'd expected, which was foolish of her because she'd had no real basis for expectation. She'd imagined someone older, harder-edged, the way newspaper people in the territory tended to be. Ford was perhaps 35, with a scholar's build and a scholar's tendency toward too many books in too many pockets. She could see the outlines of at least 2 notebooks through his coat, and the particular alertness of someone whose job was to pay attention in rooms where other people had stopped looking carefully. He was in the hotel dining room when she and Cade came in, at a corner table with papers spread in front of him, talking to a man she didn't immediately recognize. Then she looked again. Joe Finch. Joe Finch had made it to town, which meant he'd broken trail from his property on the north side and arrived. She looked at the state of him, the dried snow still in his coat, the tiredness in his face. Probably this morning, early. He'd come to meet the correspondent himself. Joe looked up when they came in, and something in his expression loosened slightly, the relief of a man who'd been holding a difficult position alone and has just seen reinforcements. "Miss Mercer," Ford said, standing, "I've been waiting. The storm complicated things." "It complicated everything," she said. "How much has Mr. Finch told you?" "The broad outline. I need the documents." She reached into her coat and produced the folded papers. The survey copy, the right-of-way application notice, the letter from Porter, the statement she'd drafted from Ruth Keller's account. She put them on the table in front of him in the order she'd organized them, most foundational first. He read. He read the way people read when reading is their actual skill, fast, completely, without the performance of reading. His pen moved occasionally. "The survey copy is a certified territorial reproduction," he said without looking up. "Yes. Filed March 15th with the Territorial Land Office in Laramie. Obtained legally, on record." "And the right-of-way application?" "Filed by Wyoming Basin Railroad in October, 2 weeks before the bank called our loan." She sat across from him. 3 weeks before the Stanhope loan was recalled. The Greer widows' water rights inquiry came in the same week. He looked up then. "How many families? Along Broken Creek with documented contact from the bank this fall?" 7. Families who received either accelerated repayment notices or direct inquiries about water rights transfers. All with properties in the survey corridor. All of them. He looked at the papers again. Then he looked at Cade. You brought these to Voss in person. I did. He said you were persuasive. I was accurate, Cade said. There's a difference. Something moved in Ford's expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. There is. He stacked the papers carefully and put his hand flat on top of them. I need to speak with Holt. The table went quiet. If I'm going to print this, Ford said, I give the subject an opportunity to respond. That's not courtesy, it's methodology. An accusation without the accused's response is advocacy, not reporting. He looked at Evelyn. It also, practically speaking, gives him the chance to deny it on record, which occasionally prompts men to say revealing things when they believe they're defending themselves. Evelyn thought about what Cade had said. Controlled men didn't typically get reckless. But controlled men under unexpected pressure, facing an outcome they hadn't planned for, that was a different calculation. When? She asked. Ford looked at the papers, then at his watch. Now, I think. Is the bank open? If Holt is in town and he knows the deadline is today, Cade said, he'll be at the bank. They went as a group, which had not been exactly planned but assembled itself naturally. Evelyn and Cade. Joe Finch, who stood from the table with the deliberate movement of a man whose joints had gone stiff in the cold, but whose intention was completely solid. Elias Ford with his coat and his notebooks. And from the street, where word had moved the way it always moved in small towns, faster than any horse, the Halverson brothers, who had tied their Clydesdales and were standing on the cleared section of Main Street with their arms folded, and Harold Stanhope, who had apparently also made it in this morning and had Marion Greer with him, the widow from the East Bend property, small and upright and ferociously focused. They did not go in a mob. They went in a purposeful group, which is a different thing, and the difference was visible in how they moved, not angry, not theatrical, just resolute in the way people are resolute when they've decided that a thing is going to happen. First Territorial Bank of Red Hollow was open. Harold Briggs, the clerk who'd ridden out to the Mercer farm 30 days ago with the envelope he couldn't quite look her in the eye while delivering, was behind the counter. He saw them coming through the window, and his expression went through several stages rapidly before settling on the pale, tight look of a man who understands that something he's been part of is about to become visible. Raymond Holt was in his private office. Briggs went and knocked, and Holt came out, and the moment he stepped through the office door and saw the room, Evelyn, Cade, Joe Finch, the Halversons, the Stanhopes, Marion Greer, and the stranger with the notebooks, his face did something careful and controlled. He assembled himself. Miss Mercer, he said, I was expecting you. I imagine you were, she said. Today is the deadline. It is. He looked at the room with the evaluating eye of a man conducting a rapid assessment. His gaze paused on Elias Ford in the way that a practiced businessman's gaze paused on an unfamiliar element in a familiar equation. And you've brought guests. This is Elias Ford, Evelyn said. He's a correspondent for the Wyoming Examiner. A very small thing happened in Holt's face. So small that if she hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. The controlled exterior held, but something underneath it made a brief, involuntary adjustment. He knew what the Wyoming Examiner was. He knew what Charles Voss had done to the Carbon County land scheme. And he was doing, in real time, exactly what Evelyn had hoped he would do, recalculating. Mr. Ford, Holt said pleasantly, what brings the Examiner to Red Hollow? A story, Ford said. He opened his notebook. Mr. Holt, are you familiar with an entity called Wyoming Basin Railroad? The pleasantness stayed in Holt's expression, but it was working harder now. I'm aware of it. A private short-line company exploring development in the territory. Are you an investor in Wyoming Basin Railroad? I have a small interest in various territorial development enterprises. That's a matter of public record. Is it? Ford made a note. The Territorial Commerce Registry in Cheyenne doesn't currently list Wyoming Basin Railroad's investors publicly. Are you saying you've made a voluntary disclosure somewhere? The pleasantness slipped 1 degree. I may have been imprecise. My attorney would have the specifics. Of course. Ford made another note. Mr. Holt, Wyoming Basin Railroad filed a right-of-way application with the Territorial Land Office in October of this year. The survey corridor they filed follows Broken Creek through this valley for approximately 11 miles. Several of the properties in that corridor are held by people in this room, people who received accelerated loan repayment demands from your bank in the same month that right-of-way application was filed. Can you explain that timing? Holt looked at the room again. His gaze moved from face to face. Evelyn, Joe Finch, the Halverson brothers, Marion Greer, and she watched him understand that this was not one family in financial trouble he could pressure separately. This was 11 families who now knew what their land was worth and why someone wanted it, standing in the same room at the same moment, speaking with the same voice. The bank's loan management decisions are made on the basis of borrower financial health, not external. Mr. Holt? Marion Greer spoke from near the door. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had run a farm alone for 4 years and buried a husband and dealt with harder things than a banker's practiced evasions. 2 men came to my property in October and told me they were from the county assessor's office. They asked about my water rights. They had a letter on Wyoming Basin Land Survey Associates stationery, which is not a county office. Did you send them? I'm not familiar with... I have the letter, Marion said. The date on it is October 3rd. Your bank's repayment demand arrived October 19th. She paused. I find that sequence interesting. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. Miss Mercer, he said. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but the pleasantness was gone, replaced by something that was trying to decide between negotiation and retreat. Your loan balance, $243. Yes, I'm prepared to discuss an extension of the repayment period given the weather complications. We're not here about an extension, Evelyn said. He waited. We're here about the loan itself, she said. The Mercer Farm loan and every accelerated repayment demand you've issued to properties in the Wyoming Basin Railroad Survey Corridor in the past 90 days. She looked at him steadily. We're asking you to withdraw all of them, immediately, and to have your bank's connection to the Wyoming Basin Railroad and to Gerald Ashford's land speculation activities reviewed by the Territorial Banking Commissioner. The room was very quiet. Holt's face went through something private and contained and mostly invisible. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the assessment of what she had, what Ford would write, what the Territorial Banking Commissioner's office would do with a formal complaint accompanied by documented evidence in a territorial newspaper. She could see him arriving at the same conclusion she had, that the scheme worked when its subjects didn't know the whole picture, and the whole picture was now clearly known. Mr. Briggs, Holt said without looking away from Evelyn. The clerk appeared from behind the counter. Pull the Mercer file. Briggs went. The others, Evelyn said. Holt's jaw worked briefly. Pull the Stanhope file, the Greer file, the Halverson file. He looked at Joe Finch. Finch? I didn't receive a notice, Joe said, but my neighbor did. All properties in the Broken Creek Valley with accelerated demands issued in the past 90 days, Holt said to Briggs. Pull them. Briggs went to pull them. It took 3 hours, not because the mechanics were complex. The withdrawals of the acceleration demands were a matter of paperwork and signature, but because each family in the room had their own questions, their own numbers to verify, their own accumulated mistrust of the man across the desk that had to be worked through before signatures meant anything. Harold Stanhope argued about fees that had been added to his balance. Marion Greer insisted on a written confirmation that no water rights transfer application had been submitted or would be submitted on her behalf without her explicit documented consent. Joe Finch sat quietly through most of it and asked one very precise question at the end about the legal status of the right-of-way application itself and what it meant for property values along the corridor going forward. Cade sat in the corner of the room and didn't say much. Elias Ford sat at the far end of the counter and took notes. Evelyn moved between the conversations, translating, clarifying, keeping the energy in the room from tipping into the kind of chaos that let a man like Holt find the gaps to slip through. She was exhausted in a way that had gone past physical and was operating in some deeper register, the exhaustion of someone who has been running on fear and determination for 30 days and is beginning to feel the ground under the fear, the solid surface that fear had been covering all along. When Harold Stanhope signed his withdrawal notice and sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd set down something heavy, he looked at Evelyn and said, "How did you know?" "I didn't," she said honestly. "I just kept asking what the actual shape of the problem was until I could see it." He nodded slowly. "My Clara said the same thing when she got home from your visit. Said you made her look at the books differently." He paused. "Women are better at that than men, I think. Looking at the actual shape of things. Men are better at it too," she said, "when someone makes them look." Harold smiled at that, the first smile she'd seen from him in a long time. At 4 in the afternoon, Holt signed the last withdrawal notice. He did it without theater, without any of the speeches that men of his type sometimes produced in defeat, and she respected that about him, in the cold and specific way you could respect a thing about an opponent without it meaning anything good about them. He was a man who'd played a calculated game and lost it when the information asymmetry collapsed, and he had the discipline to lose without noise. She didn't think this was over. She thought it was the end of this particular maneuver, and that a man like Holt, with his investments in Wyoming Basin Railroad and his connections to Gerald Ashford, would find other approaches. Elias Ford's story would cause damage, real damage, to his local standing and possibly to the railroad company's ability to operate through the territory without scrutiny. But damage was not destruction, and she'd be foolish to mistake the one for the other. But the loan was withdrawn. The deadline was gone. The farm was still theirs. That was today. Today was enough. They came out of the bank in the late afternoon light, which in a Wyoming December was already going orange and thin at the edges, the sky beginning the long blue fade toward dark. Main Street had been broken out further during the hours they'd been inside. More shovels, more hands, and there were people moving in the cleared sections, looking at each other with the particular look of a community that has shared a hard thing and is working out what that means. Marion Greer stopped on the boardwalk and turned her face up to the cold sky for a moment with her eyes closed. It was an unguarded gesture, and Evelyn looked away from it because some moments of private relief deserved not to be witnessed. Joe Finch shook her hand with both of his, the elder man's version of an embrace, and said, "Your mother would have done exactly this," and walked to his horse. The Halverson brothers were already on their Clydesdales turning toward home. Peter Halverson raised a hand without looking back, which was as much ceremony as he was built for, and which Evelyn found entirely appropriate. Harold Stanhope and his sons lingered longer, Clara having come in behind them at some point during the afternoon, Evelyn wasn't sure when, and Clara Stanhope came to Evelyn and did something unexpected. She hugged her. It wasn't a gentle hug. It was the hug of a woman who'd been terrified for months and had a safe landing, and it had pressure behind it. Evelyn hugged her back. After the Stanhopes left, it was just Evelyn and Cade and Elias Ford on the boardwalk. Ford was reviewing his notes in the fading light, already organizing what he'd write. He looked up. "I'll need follow-up," he said. "The Gerald Ashford connection, the Wyoming Basin investors. That story doesn't end here." "I know," Evelyn said. "If you find more documentation, or if the railroad company proceeds with land acquisition through other means, I want to know." "You'll know." He nodded, closed his notebook, and extended his hand. She shook it. He extended his hand to Cade, who shook it with his good hand. Then Ford went back into the hotel, and they were alone on the boardwalk in the fading December light. The silence between them was different from any previous silence. There was something resolved in it, not the resolution of everything, but of the specific terrible pressure of the past 30 days, and the absence of that pressure felt, paradoxically, like new weight. As if the emergency had been the structure holding her upright, and now that it was gone, she had to find her own. "Your arm," she said. "I know. You need to stop using it. I know that too." He looked at the street, at the tracks in the snow, and the lit windows of the businesses, and the hotel chimney smoke going straight up in the still air after the storm. "I need to look at the barn wall before dark." "Daniel can look at the barn wall." "It needs Cade." She said his name the way she'd been saying it for weeks, with the particular inflection that meant stop deflecting. "Let Daniel look at the barn wall. Come inside." He looked at her, the storm-gray eyes in the orange December light. Something in them that she'd been careful not to name and was finding it harder to be careful about. "All right," he said. They walked back to where the sled was tied and started the drive home on the broken-out road. the cold coming down harder as the light went, the sky turning that deep blue black that arrived fast in Wyoming winter evenings. The horse moved steadily in the channel they'd broken that morning, the familiar ground of the road to the farm, the tree line on the left, and the creek on the right, and the roof lines of home appearing ahead in the dark. She was aware of him sitting beside her on the sled, the proximity that had accumulated over weeks of close work and shared emergency into something that had its own weight and warmth. She was aware of the conversation they had not yet had, the one that had been waiting behind the deadline in the storm and the bank and the newspaper correspondent, waiting with the patience of something that knew it had nowhere to go. "When this is settled," she said. She meant the farm, the railroad question, the ongoing uncertainty of what Holt might do next. She meant all the practical things that were still not resolved. "Yes," he said. He understood what she meant. "When it's settled." The horse pulled them home through the cold and the dark, and the farmhouse windows were lit ahead of them. Her father had gotten the lamps, and the barn wall was standing, and the road behind them was open, and the deadline had passed without taking anything it wasn't supposed to take. She didn't let herself feel it fully yet. There was too much still uncertain, too much that could yet go wrong, and she'd learned the hard way that relief taken too early cost you the alertness you needed for what came next. But she let herself feel the edge of it. Just the edge. The farm was still theirs. 3 days later, the Wyoming Examiner ran a front-page story. The headline, she read it from the copy that came on the weekly Post rider, sitting at the kitchen table with her father and Daniel and Cade gathered around like they were waiting for something, which they were. Read, Territorial Bank and Private Railroad linked in coordinated land acquisition scheme along Broken Creek Valley. The byline was Elias Ford's. The story was careful and precise and documented every claim with the sources she'd provided and the additional verification Ford had conducted in the days since their meeting. It named Gerald Ashford by name, described the Wyoming Basin Railroad's filing and its relationship to the bank's loan acceleration timeline, and quoted Marion Greer's account of the false county assessor visit at length. It quoted Evelyn herself in 3 places. She didn't remember Ford having spoken to her specifically, but he'd apparently been paying closer attention in the bank than she'd realized. It did not accuse Holt of a crime. It didn't need to. It described with the precision of documented evidence exactly what had happened and left the reader to draw the obvious conclusion. She read the story through once, then again. Her father read it after her, slowly, his finger tracing the lines. Daniel read it standing up, too keyed to sit. Cade didn't read it. He'd been at the barn since early morning, working on the wall with his right hand and the limited use of the left that the splint allowed, making permanent what they'd made temporary in the storm. She took the newspaper out to him. He read it leaning against the barn door in the pale winter light, the paper held in his good hand. She watched his face while he read and saw the various things move through it. Recognition, satisfaction, something more private at the end that she didn't try to identify. He handed it back. "Ford's good," he said. "Yes." "This will reach Cheyenne by next week. Ashford will know." "I expect so." He looked at the barn wall. "Doesn't end it." "No," she agreed, "but it changes the ground. It does that." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Your father read it?" "Twice." "How is he?" She thought about how her father had looked, sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper, reading the words that described what had been done to his family and what his daughter had done about it. How his face had done something complicated and private that she'd chosen not to watch too closely. "He's Thomas Mercer," she said. "So he didn't say much." She paused. But when he finished, he called Daniel over and showed him the part where it describes the survey documents and explained what it meant. Spent about 20 minutes on it. She looked at the barn wall. "He hasn't explained anything to Daniel in about a year." Cade nodded slowly. He understood what that meant. She looked at the newspaper in her hand. The story. The documented shape of the thing they'd been up against and how they'd met it. Her name in print in the Wyoming Examiner, which she'd never expected, and which felt strange and small compared to the actual weight of the past 30 days, but which was also real in a way that the last month's fear and work and cold had sometimes not felt real. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "What were you going to do before you rode into Red Hollow?" She looked at him. Where were you going? He was quiet for a moment. The question had the quality of something she'd been holding for a while, and he seemed to recognize that. North, he said. Montana, maybe. I had a thought about a ranch operation north of Billings that was looking for experienced hands. And now? He looked at the barn wall, the braced section, the work he'd been doing with one good hand on a structure that needed more than temporary repair. He looked at it the way a man looked at a thing he'd decided to stay with. Now I'm fixing a barn wall, he said. It wasn't an answer that covered everything. She knew that. He knew that she knew. But it was an honest answer, and honest answers from this man had always been worth more than comprehensive ones from other people. She folded the newspaper carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Come in for lunch when you're ready, she said. Give me an hour. She went back across the yard toward the farmhouse. The snow was bright and hard in the winter light, the kind of surface that hurt to look at directly. Behind her, she could hear the sound of Cade working, the careful, deliberate sound of someone building something meant to last. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The Territorial Banking Commissioner's office opened a formal inquiry into First Territorial Bank of Red Hollow 6 weeks after Elias Ford's story ran in the Wyoming Examiner. Evelyn learned about it the same way she learned most things that winter, through Joe Finch, who heard it from his son Henry, who had it from the postwriter who came through from Laramie on a Thursday. By then she was deep in the work of early spring preparation, the ground still frozen but showing the first signs of yielding, and the news landed somewhere in the middle of a day already full of tasks, and simply became one more fact about the changed shape of the world. Raymond Holt resigned from First Territorial Bank before the inquiry concluded. He was gone from Red Hollow by March. His house on the north end of Main Street shuttered, his office cleared, his name removed from the bank's sign and replaced with the name of a manager sent from the Cheyenne parent company to handle the transition. Whether Gerald Ashford faced any formal consequences from the Wyoming Basin Railroad affair, Evelyn never learned with certainty. Porter wrote that the railroad company had quietly withdrawn its right-of-way application for the Broken Creek corridor and was pursuing a different route further east, which was a kind of consequence, she supposed, even if it wasn't the satisfying specific kind. Wade Pruitt, without Holt's backing and without the Caldwell Cattle Company's goodwill, which evaporated once the Caldwell principals in Cheyenne read the Examiner story and decided association with the scheme was a liability, left Red Hollow before spring. Nobody in town spoke much about his leaving. Some departures were mourned and some were simply noted, and Pruitt's was the second kind. The barn wall, the one Cade had braced in the dark, and the blizzard, was properly rebuilt in February. Not by Cade alone. He couldn't manage heavy timber work with the cracked ulna still mending, but by Cade directing and Daniel doing and Joe Finch's sons coming over 2 Saturdays in a row to help with the framing. It took longer than it would have taken a full crew working freely, and the finished wall was not as square as Cade would have liked, and he said so, and Daniel told him that a barn wall that kept cattle warm didn't need to be square, and Cade said that was an argument made by people who hadn't learned to do things right, and Daniel said that was the most words he'd ever heard Cade say at once, and even Thomas Mercer, sitting in his chair with his bad legs stretched out, made a sound that was most of the way to a laugh. It was the first time Evelyn had heard anything close to laughter in that kitchen since before her father's accident. She was at the stove when it happened, and she kept her back to the room for a moment, because some things you wanted to hold privately before they became ordinary. She and Cade had their actual conversation in March, when the ground was beginning to soften, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the farm was stepping out of winter's grip with the particular rawness of something emerging from a long stillness. They were at the creek when it happened, which seemed appropriate given how many honest things had been said at that water. She'd gone down to check the bank's erosion after the melt, and he'd followed, and they'd stood watching the high, fast water for a while before he said, without preamble, "I'd like to stay." "You've been staying," she said. "I'd like to stay as something specific," he said. "Not a hired man, not a guest." He looked at the water. "I'm not good at this kind of talking. I want you to know that up front so you don't mistake the plainness for not meaning it." "I don't mistake plainness," she said. "I appreciate it." "Then here it is plain." He turned to look at her. "I want to build something here with you, if you want that. I know what I am. I know I've been a drifter, and I know the farm is yours and your family's, and I'm not coming in claiming anything, But I think I could be useful for more than fixing fence lines, if you'd let me. She looked at him for a long moment. The cracked arm was healing, and his face had lost the worn-down quality it had carried through the worst of the winter, and he was looking at her with that direct, stripped-down attention he gave to problems he'd decided to solve. Except this was not a problem, or not only a problem, and they both understood the difference. "You're asking me to marry you," she said, without quite saying it. He considered this. "I suppose I am." "Then say it." He looked at the creek, then back at her. "Will you marry me, Evelyn Mercer?" "Yes," she said, "but you should know I'm not easy to live with." "I know that already. And I'll keep the books myself." "I expected that. And my father stays." I never suggested otherwise. Something shifted in his face, the ghost of the smile she'd been watching for months. "Are there more conditions?" "Probably," she said. "I'll think of them." They were married in May, in the same community hall where they'd first met at the harvest supper 6 months earlier. It was not a large wedding by any calculation. The hall held maybe 40 people. But the 40 people who came were the ones who'd been through the winter alongside them. And a room full of people who'd shared something real was worth more than a room full of people who'd only shown up for the occasion. Thomas Mercer walked his daughter down the length of the hall on his crutch, without stumbling, without stopping. She felt his arm trembling slightly under hers, and she held it steadily, and they didn't look at each other until they reached the end. And then he looked at her with everything a man like Thomas Mercer was never going to put into words. And she squeezed his arm once, and he stepped back and let her go. What she thought about later when she tried to make sense of what that winter had been, not the romance of it, which was real, but was also the smallest part, but the full shape of what had happened, was how much of it had come down to information. Holt had won, for months, simply because he knew something the families along Broken Creek didn't know. The moment the information became shared, his advantage collapsed. It was almost embarrassingly simple, in retrospect. Not the dramatic confrontation she'd imagined when she lay awake doing arithmetic, but a matter of people in the same room knowing the same things at the same time. She thought the lesson in that was something worth carrying. The other thing she thought about, the harder thing, the one she came back to on cold mornings when the farm was quiet, and Cade was already outside, and the world had the particular still clarity of very early winter light, was what it had taken to stay. Not to stay in the physical sense, though that had been hard enough, but to stay present inside the terror of losing everything, to not detach from it, and call the detachment strength. She had been close, more than once, to deciding she was being stubborn for its own sake. That the dignified thing was to accept the loss and move forward, and stop making things difficult for everyone. She hadn't. Kate hadn't. And she didn't think that was stubbornness in the end. She thought it was the refusal to let someone else's definition of her situation become the truth. That distinction was worth something. She wasn't sure it was a lesson you could teach anyone directly. It was more the kind of thing you learned by being in a position where you had to choose between it and its opposite, and then living with which one you chose. The farm survived the following years by being what Cade had always thought it could be. Not just crops or just cattle, but a combination. Horse breeding added in the 3rd year, a small lumber operation in the 4th when the North Lot timber came ready. None of it was easy. Some seasons were hard in ways that recalled the worst of 1879, and twice they came close enough to the edge of solvency that she pulled out the old ledger book and sat with the numbers until they yielded. They always yielded, barely, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether this life was sustainable. Barely was enough. Barely, maintained over years, became something solid. Red Hollow grew. Not fast and not without setbacks, but it grew in the way that places grow when the people in them have decided to stay. Incrementally, imperfectly, with the occasional backward slide, but persistently. A second general store, a schoolhouse, a proper telegraph office by 1885. The railroad did come through eventually, not Wyoming Basin, but the Union Pacific secondary line, and when it did, the Mercer-Rowan water rights were worth exactly what Holt had calculated they would be, except that Evelyn negotiated the access agreement herself, with Elias Ford having written her a letter of introduction to the Union Pacific's Regional Council, and the Mercer-Rowan water stayed the Mercer-Rowans. Cade became, over the years, the kind of man that a frontier community produced rarely and valued deeply, Not because he was the most capable, though he was capable, and not because he was the most likable, which he was never going to be in the backslapping, easy way that some men were likable, but because when things went wrong, which they did regularly and in variety, he was the person people thought of first, not to save them, just to help them see the actual shape of the problem. He told Evelyn once, late in a winter evening when the children were in bed and the fire was low, that he'd spent so many years being good at leaving that he'd forgotten it was a skill and started thinking it was a virtue. "What changed your mind?" she asked. He looked at the fire for a while. Then, "You didn't quit." "I nearly did." "Nearly is the whole thing," he said. "Nearly and didn't. That's the whole thing." She thought about that for a long time after, long enough that it settled into the category of true things she carried without always thinking about. The way you carried the knowledge of how the creek ran or where the frost came first on the property. Just part of the known landscape. The frontier was not a romantic place. It was a hard place full of hard people doing hard things with incomplete information and inadequate tools. And most of what happened there was less dramatic than people made it sound, and more relentless than they were willing to admit. You survived it not through any single act of courage, but through the accumulation of small decisions. To fix the fence today, to check the numbers again, to go to one more meeting, to ask one more question, to stay one more season. And sometimes, if you were stubborn enough, and lucky enough, and honest enough about the actual shape of what you were dealing with, you didn't just survive it. You built something that stood,